Throughout history, explorers have ventured into the most remote and unforgiving corners of the world, driven by curiosity, ambition, or the pursuit of knowledge. Yet for some expeditions, the maps were never completed, the journals left blank, and the discoveries quietly obscured. From frozen Arctic wastelands to dense, uncharted rainforests, these journeys carry a shadow of secrecy, where the line between daring exploration and unexplained disappearance often blurs. As you follow the footsteps of these lost and silenced expeditions, you will traverse snowbound Arctic plains, traverse the tangled canopies of the Amazon, and cross glaciers that glitter under a pale, distant sun. Along the way, the strange gaps in records, mysterious obstacles, and sudden halts in scientific inquiry reveal patterns of cover-ups that still defy explanation. Each tale uncovers the tension between human ambition and forces that remain hidden, leaving questions that linger long after the explorers themselves vanish. Franklin's lost orders. The disappearance of Sir John Franklin's Arctic expedition has long been framed as a tragic encounter between ambition and ice, yet buried beneath the familiar story is a quieter and more unsettling question about what was deliberately removed from the historical record. When HMS Erebus and HMS Terror sailed from Greenhithe in May 1845, they carried not only provisions and men but written orders issued by the British Admiralty, documents that defined the expedition's objectives, limits and contingencies. Those orders, referenced repeatedly in correspondence and early reports, would later become conspicuously absent from official archives, leaving behind a carefully shaped narrative that emphasized heroic failure while obscuring administrative decisions that may have sealed the expedition's fate. At the time, Franklin was a celebrated naval officer with extensive Arctic experience, chosen to command a mission intended to complete the Northwest Passage. The Admiralty's instructions were not casual suggestions, but binding directives, outlining where the ships were to proceed, how long they were to persist, and when retreat was expected. Contemporary naval practice required strict adherence to such orders, especially in polar exploration, where deviation could mean disaster. Yet, when later historians sought to reconstruct Franklin's exact mandate, they encountered gaps where official paperwork should have existed, replaced instead by summaries, paraphrases, or second-hand references that hinted at constraints no longer visible in full. Evidence of these missing instructions emerges early in the search efforts that followed Franklin's disappearance. When concern mounted after the expedition failed to return by 1847, the Admiralty launched a series of rescue missions, many led by men who had known Franklin personally. Their reports often referred obliquely to original orders or intended routes without quoting them directly, suggesting that the documents were known but not shared. In parliamentary discussions and public statements, officials avoided specifics, offering reassurance that Franklin had been well equipped and properly guided, while sidestepping questions about whether his orders allowed flexibility in the face of worsening ice conditions. The physical evidence recovered decades later only deepened the uncertainty. In 1859, Francis Leopold McClintock's expedition discovered the now famous Victory Point record on King William Island, the sole written message left behind by Franklin's men. The note confirmed the abandonment of the ships in April 1848 and listed the deaths of Franklin and others, but it made no mention of standing orders, fallback plans, or instructions from London. This omission is striking, given that naval protocol emphasized documentation and accountability, especially in extreme circumstances. The silence of the record raised the possibility that the men either believed the orders were already known, or that those instructions had become irrelevant, impractical, or even damaging to acknowledge. As the 19th century progressed, the Admiralty curated Franklin's legacy with care. Official publications, memorials, and sponsored accounts emphasized endurance, sacrifice, and national pride, transforming the expedition into a symbol of heroic exploration. Within this framework, administrative misjudgments had no place. Scholars later noted that certain Admiralty files relating to Arctic exploration were incomplete or reorganized, with some correspondence surviving only in private collections or later transcriptions. The absence of Franklin's full orders stood out as more than an archival accident, especially given the meticulous preservation of similar documents for other naval voyages of the era. The possibility that Franklin was instructed to persist beyond reasonable limits has remained a point of quiet debate. Some historians have suggested that the Admiralty, eager to secure imperial prestige, may have encouraged prolonged exploration even at great risk. Such directives would have aligned with the era's competitive spirit but conflicted with later attempts to portray the expedition as a victim of unforeseeable natural forces. If such language existed in Franklin's orders, its disappearance would have served to protect institutional reputation, shifting responsibility away from policy and onto the unforgiving Arctic environment. Further suspicion arises from the way later search expeditions were directed. Rescue missions were often sent along routes that Franklin was assumed to have taken based on inferred intentions rather than documented instructions. This reliance on assumption rather than citation suggests that the original orders were either inaccessible or intentionally withheld. In private letters, some officers hinted at frustration with the Admiralty's control over information, noting that decisions were being justified with documents they themselves had never seen. These fragments of dissent, scattered and understated, contrast sharply with the confident public posture maintained by officials in London. The handling of Inuit testimony adds another layer to the story. Indigenous accounts collected during search expeditions described starving men, abandoned ships, and desperate marches southward, details that conflicted with the dignified image promoted by the Admiralty. While these testimonies did not reference written orders directly, they underscored how far events had diverged from any original plan. The reluctance to integrate such accounts into official histories mirrored the reluctance to release complete documentation, reinforcing the sense that the narrative was being filtered to preserve a particular interpretation of events. By the time the wrecks of Erebus and Terror were finally located in the 21st century, the mystery of the missing orders had become embedded in the expedition's legacy. The discoveries confirmed aspects of the written record but did little to clarify the administrative decisions made before departure. No cache of instructions emerged from the seabed, and no definitive copy surfaced in Admiralty archives, despite advances in cataloguing and preservation. The absence itself became part of the evidence, a negative space where accountability should have resided. What remains is a portrait of an expedition shaped as much by what was withheld as by what was endured. Franklin's men faced ice, cold and starvation, but the decisions that placed them in that position were made far away, in offices where ink on paper carried life and death consequences. The loss of those papers, whether through negligence or design, ensured that the Admiralty's role would remain blurred, allowing the story to settle into myth rather than scrutiny. In that silence, the vanished orders continue to suggest that the greatest mystery of the Franklin expedition may not lie beneath Arctic ice, but within the records that never resurfaced. And somewhere between the departure from England and the careful pruning of history that followed, the written commands guiding Franklin north disappeared, leaving behind a tragedy whose official explanation still rests on documents no one can now produce. The Dyatlov files that were sealed. Snow covered the northern Ural mountains long before investigators arrived, but the fate of the Dyatlov expedition would ultimately be shaped not only by what happened in the cold, but by what was later controlled, sealed and withheld. In late winter of 1959, a ski expedition ended in unexplained deaths on the eastern slope of Kholat-Syakhl, a remote peak in Sverdlovsk Oblast. What followed was not simply an inquiry into a fatal accident, but the construction of an official case file that would remain inaccessible for decades. From its earliest moments, the Dyatlov investigation bore signs of restriction, suggesting that the mystery extended beyond the mountain and into the mechanisms that governed how the truth could be recorded. 9 hikers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute set out in January on a Category 3 winter trek, the highest difficulty rating at the time, led by the experienced student Igor Dyatlov. Their route passed through sparsely populated terrain, far from settlements, where temperatures routinely fell below -30°C. When the group failed to return by their expected date, a search was eventually organised involving volunteers, students and later military personnel. The discovery of their tent, partially collapsed and cut open from the inside, immediately contradicted ordinary expectations of survival behaviour in extreme cold, raising questions that the investigation would never fully resolve. When the abandoned campsite and bodies were formally examined, the official inquiry advanced with striking speed. Prosecutors documented the scene, collected items, and ordered autopsies, yet the case was closed within months. The conclusion cited a compelling natural force as the cause of death, a phrase that offered neither mechanism nor accountability. This language was unusual for a Soviet legal document, which typically emphasized material causation. Its vagueness functioned as an endpoint rather than an explanation, closing the case while leaving its central contradictions untouched. From the moment the case file was compiled, access to its contents became tightly restricted, transforming a remote mountain tragedy into a controlled matter of state record. The investigation was classified, and for decades researchers, relatives and independent analysts were unable to review the full documentation. Only after the dissolution of the Soviet Union were portions of the file released, and even then archivists acknowledged that not all materials were present. The existence of missing documents was not denied, but it was never explained, leaving the file complete enough to appear authoritative while remaining fundamentally incomplete. As fragments of the record became available, careful readers began to notice internal inconsistencies. Evidence logs referenced photographs that were not included, and descriptions of clothing and equipment did not always match surviving images. Some pages appeared out of sequence, while others bore stamps indicating review by authorities not normally associated with civilian accident investigations. These irregularities did not point to a single alternative explanation, but they did reveal a process in which the documentation itself had been shaped, edited, and possibly reduced before being preserved. Among the details quietly noted in early reports were traces of radiation found on several articles of clothing. This fact was confirmed in laboratory analyses and entered into the case materials without elaboration. At the time, the Soviet Union tightly controlled information related to nuclear research, industrial contamination, and military testing. Any implication that such activities might have intersected with a civilian expedition would have carried serious consequences. The presence of radiation was therefore acknowledged in the record but not pursued, treated as an anomaly rather than a line of inquiry. The Dyatlov Pass lay within a region that, during the late 1950s, carried strategic sensitivities few civilians were meant to question. The northern Urals were home to military installations, restricted airspace, and testing activity that remained classified for decades. While no document in the released case file directly connected the hikers to these operations, the broader context explains why certain explanations would have been unacceptable. In such an environment, sealing an investigation was not an extraordinary act, but a routine method of preventing unapproved narratives from emerging. Accounts from searchers and local witnesses existed alongside the official conclusions, yet many were absent from published summaries. Some described lights in the sky during the relevant period, while others recalled unusual conditions on the slope. These statements were recorded informally or mentioned later in memoirs, but they were not integrated into the formal case outcome. Soviet media restrictions ensured that only the sanctioned version of events reached the public, reinforcing the authority of the closed file while marginalizing conflicting observations. Decades later, when political changes allowed renewed attention to the incident, investigators confronted an archive already defined by absence. Reopened inquiries relied on the same incomplete materials, supplemented by recollections and secondary evidence. New explanations were proposed ranging from avalanches to atmospheric phenomena, yet each depended on records that could no longer be verified in full. The missing elements of the original investigation limited every subsequent attempt at resolution, ensuring that uncertainty remained embedded in the case. By the time the Dyatlov incident entered broader public consciousness, it had become less a single unexplained tragedy than a study in how information is constrained. The mountain preserved physical traces of what happened, but the file preserved only what authorities permitted to survive. In that sense, the sealed documents did not merely obscure the truth, they reshaped it, guiding interpretation for generations and leaving behind a mystery defined as much by administrative silence as by frozen ground. Long after the snow melted from the slope where the hikers died, the most enduring obstruction remained the sealed pages that determined what the world was allowed to know. Mallory's missing camera. High on the upper slopes of Mount Everest, where sound thins and distance distorts scale, the most consequential artifact of a 1924 expedition was not something found, but something that never emerged from the ice. The mountain has a way of reducing history to fragments, preserving boots, ropes and bodies while erasing context and intent. In the case of George Mallory, that erasure centred on a single missing object, a camera believed to have been carried during the final ascent. Its absence has shaped nearly a century of debate, not because it was lost by chance, but because what it might have shown carried consequences that extended far beyond one climb. In June of that year, George Mallory and Andrew Irvine were last observed moving upward along the northeast ridge during the British expedition's third summit attempt. The sighting was made by geologist Noel Odell, who watched the two men disappear into the cloud near a prominent step on the ridge, still climbing strongly. Shortly afterward, the weather closed in, and they were never seen alive again. No radio contact was possible, and no further sightings were recorded. What happened above that point became one of the most enduring unanswered questions in mountaineering history, balance between possibility and silence. Unlike many unanswered questions in exploration history, this one narrowed to a single object small enough to fit inside a jacket pocket. Mallory was known to carry a camera on the expedition, and accounts from fellow climbers indicate that he intended to photograph the summit if he reached it. Summit photography was already an established practice by the early 20th century, serving as both proof and record. In an era before satellite tracking or GPS data, an image taken from the top of Everest would have been decisive, settling forever whether Mallory and Irvine achieved the ascent nearly 3 decades before Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. When Mallory's body was located in 1999 at an altitude of roughly 8,155 metres, the inventory of items recovered was thorough, methodical, and revealing in its omissions. His clothing, personal effects, and climbing equipment were carefully documented, providing valuable insight into his final moments. Yet the camera was not among the recovered objects. The absence stood out precisely because so much else had survived. In the cold, arid environment of Everest's upper slopes, objects can remain preserved for decades, making the missing camera not merely lost, but conspicuously unaccounted for. At the centre of the uncertainty was what a photograph could have settled with absolute finality. If an image existed showing the summit plateau, it would have rewritten the official chronology of Everest and altered the narrative of human achievement on the mountain. Such proof would have complicated long-held claims, national pride, and the symbolic significance attached to the 1953 ascent. Without the camera, the question remained open, allowing history to balance on inference rather than evidence, and leaving institutions free to maintain established milestones without contradiction. For decades, the unresolved question of who first stood on Everest's summit carried symbolic weight that extended well beyond climbing circles. British mountaineering history had already absorbed Mallory as a heroic figure, a man who embodied endurance and sacrifice rather than success. The absence of definitive proof allowed this image to remain intact. A confirmed summit might have reframed his legacy, shifting focus from noble failure to disputed victory, while also challenging narratives carefully shaped in the decades following the Second World War, when exploration milestones carried geopolitical resonance. Several later expeditions returned to the mountain with the specific goal of locating Andrew Irvine, whose remains were believed to be the most likely resting place of the missing camera. Irvine was known to have been carrying technical equipment, and it was widely assumed that if a camera survived, it would be with him. Search efforts focused on plausible fall lines and glacier movement patterns, guided by documented climbing routes and recovered artifacts. Yet despite advanced planning and targeted searches, no camera was found, and some areas remained unexplored due to risk, weather, or shifting priorities. Rather than closing the historical record, the camera's continued absence created a paradox in which uncertainty proved more stable than certainty. Each year without discovery reinforced a version of history that depended on ambiguity. The lack of proof allowed speculation to persist without resolution, while official accounts remained unchanged. Unlike sealed files or classified documents, this was a cover-up sustained not through active suppression, but through passive acceptance of absence, a quiet willingness to let the mountain keep its secret. Time behaves differently on Everest, where some traces remain frozen for generations, while others vanish under slow-moving ice. Bodies reappear decades later, ropes emerge from retreating glaciers, and objects surface long after their owners are gone. That the camera has not followed this pattern only deepens the mystery. its disappearance resists simple explanation, raising the possibility that it lies buried beyond reach, destroyed by impact, or located where recovery would be inconvenient rather than impossible. By the early 21st century, the question of Mallory's summit attempt had become inseparable from the quiet persistence of an object that refused to appear. The debate no longer centred solely on altitude reached or route taken, but on why definitive proof remained elusive despite repeated efforts. In this way, the missing camera transformed from a piece of equipment into a historical fulcrum, holding the story of Everest in a state of permanent suspension, where achievement and loss remain forever unresolved. Until an image surfaces from a place where light itself struggles to endure, the history of Everest remains suspended between what was climbed and what was never seen. The disappearance of Percy Fawcett's final notes. The Amazon stretched endlessly in every direction, and within that green vastness, Percy Fawcett's last observations vanished without a trace. Unlike previous expeditions he had led, this journey left no immediate record, no definitive return of letters or journals to confirm his path. For years, researchers and relatives pieced together fragments of reports, testimonies, and secondary accounts, yet each offered only tantalizing glimpses. The rainforest, relentless in its immensity, absorbed sound and memory alike, leaving only shadows of movement. In this environment, the disappearance of documents became as meaningful as the disappearance of the men themselves, a deliberate silence that reshaped the story before it could be fully told. Even before the expedition began, Fawcett's meticulous habit of sketching maps and recording notes hinted at a mind determined to control how his journey would be remembered. His earlier writings documented rivers, villages, and indigenous settlements with precise measurements, often alongside personal reflections and observational sketches. Letters to friends and colleagues carefully balanced scientific description with narrative flair, a practice that lent authority to his work while preserving mystery. Scholars and journalists relied on these notes to reconstruct previous journeys, yet the very thoroughness of his record suggested that what was missing would matter far more than what survived. When he set out with his son Jack and companion Raleigh Rimmel in 1925, the provisions, journals, and letters they carried were meant to document every stage of the trek. Packlists included field notebooks, survey instruments, and stationery intended for dispatch along their planned route. Fawcett's approach was methodical. Every river crossing, every encounter with local tribes, and every shift in terrain was to be logged. The expectation among his contemporaries was that such a disciplined system of recording would provide an unbroken chain of information. Instead, the trail abruptly ended, leaving gaps that became the defining feature of the expedition's historical record. The final letter Fawcett sent, delivered months before he disappeared, offered precise detail on river crossings and potential settlements, yet curiously avoided any mention of his ultimate destination. Sent to Colonel Smith, the letter described manageable routes, notes on topography, and intentions to explore areas rumoured to contain lost cities of the interior. The careful phrasing suggested an awareness that his communications might be intercepted or misinterpreted, yet no additional writings have ever surfaced to clarify these plans. In this sense, the last known letter functions as both an anchor and a void, a precise endpoint beyond which knowledge ceases. Subsequent expeditions found only fragments of campsites and supplies, none of the personal notebooks that had always accompanied his earlier travels. Items recovered included scattered clothing, bits of canvas, and evidence of fire pits or temporary shelters. Yet the items most valued by scholars, the field notes, sketches, and maps, remained absent. This absence was not accidental. Unlike lost equipment or mislaid provisions, Fawcett's notes had always been treated as the most portable, most recoverable items. Their disappearance suggested either deliberate concealment, destruction, or a misfortune that selectively spared other objects. Even published accounts of his previous expeditions relied heavily on edited letters and journals, revealing how intermediaries had long shaped Fawcett's voice after the fact. Editors, colleagues, and family members exercised discretion in selecting what to include, omitting passages that might confuse or contradict prevailing narratives. Consequently, the surviving corpus of Fawcett's writings presents a carefully curated legacy, one that emphasizes exploration, bravery, and observation while leaving many questions unaddressed. In this way, the absence of his final notes became amplified, the existing record could only hint at what was lost. Local testimonies collected years later mentioned sightings and traces that contradicted one another, yet no written records surfaced to corroborate them. Indigenous guides and settlers reported brief encounters, footprints and abandoned camps, often with details that conflicted from one source to the next. Without notes to verify chronology, location or intention, these accounts remained speculative, useful to the imagination but impossible to substantiate. Each fragment of oral testimony pointed to the same conclusion, that the final portion of Fawcett's journey existed in a space where observation and record could not penetrate. Institutions invested in exploration history quietly benefited from the ambiguity, allowing Fawcett's ultimate discoveries to remain tantalizingly out of reach. Universities, geographical societies, and contemporary media could celebrate his prior achievements without confronting the possibility that he'd reached extraordinary conclusions in the Amazon that would challenge established scholarship. Ambiguity became an asset. Certainty might have forced revision or confrontation with unverified claims. In this sense, the selective survival of Fawcett's work was not merely accidental, but functionally maintained by circumstance and interest alike. The absence of his final notes created a gap in understanding that no later field reports or memoirs could fill, leaving his last observations suspended in uncertainty. Scholars pieced together what little information survived, combining pre-expedition journals, letters, and oral testimony into a mosaic that suggested purpose without confirming outcome. Yet each reconstruction remained provisional, dependent on what had not vanished rather than what had endured. In this way, the missing documents took on a life of their own, becoming evidence through their absence rather than through presence. Over time, the missing pages became as integral to Fawcett's legacy as the expeditions themselves, a silent narrative that guided speculation without offering verification. Readers and historians alike are drawn to the possibility of what might have been recorded, the location of lost cities, undiscovered settlements, or routes previously unknown to Europeans. Fawcett's silence, enforced by disappearance, has become part of the legend, framing interpretation and inquiry in ways that tangible artifacts or completed reports could never have achieved. The unknown notes are more than absent. They're active participants in shaping memory. Hidden among the rivers and dense foliage of the Amazon, the truths Fawcett committed to paper may still endure, waiting for discovery in a place no map has yet revealed. The Andree expedition's edited diaries. The Arctic stretched white and silent, and within that frozen expanse, the diaries of S.A. Andree held both the promise of discovery and the distortion of later interpretation. The balloon expedition of 1897, intended to drift across the polar skies, ended in tragedy, but the story recorded in ink became almost as mysterious as the men themselves. Pages filled with measurements, observations, and daily reflections survived the Arctic ice, yet what reached the public decades later had been shaped, condensed, and subtly altered. The tension between lived experience and curated record is at the heart of the Andree mystery, where the Arctic itself bore witness, indifferent to human narrative. From the earliest preparations, Andree's meticulous planning filled page after page with measurements, calculations, and observations, documenting a journey as much in ink as it would be in flight. He drew wind patterns, mapped potential landing sites, and recorded provisions with near-scientific precision. Letters sent to colleagues described the logic behind every design choice in the balloon, from gas calculations to tethering experiments. These documents suggest a man aware of both the peril and the public importance of his venture. Each entry is a demonstration of discipline and foresight, yet hints of tension emerge in brief comments about weather or supply limitations that few later editors emphasized. As the balloon lifted from Svalbard, the expedition's notes recorded the shifting light, the wind patterns, and the fleeting clarity of the polar horizon, capturing details that would later be reshaped. Andree's pen traced observations of cloud formations, snowdrifts, and horizon markers, creating a record intended to guide others and verify his scientific reasoning. Observations were precise enough that later scholars could reconstruct flight trajectories, yet even these meticulous entries were subject to selective attention. Certain passages were highlighted in posthumous publications, while others, noting doubt or frustration, were softened or omitted, changing the tone of the narrative entirely. Even in the first days, subtle hints of struggle and uncertainty appeared in the diaries, details that were softened or excised in the versions presented to the public. Entries mentioned difficulty in controlling altitude, intermittent visibility of landmarks, and moments when the balloon seemed to falter. While these passages are brief, they convey the immense physical and psychological pressure on the crew. Editors later emphasized optimism and technical ingenuity, marginalizing or omitting any notes of fear, indecision, or miscalculation, reshaping the perception of the expedition into a story of heroic endurance rather than complex human experience. The final entries, composed under increasing strain, describe relentless wind and deteriorating equipment, yet later publications would reorder and condense these passages to emphasize heroism over hardship. The crew's attempts to navigate uncertain ice fields, the increasing weight of frost on the balloon, and the difficulty in maintaining accurate readings are documented in ways that convey both determination and despair. However, when these diaries were prepared for public consumption, chronological details were altered, some hardships minimized, and the narrative streamlined to create a sense of inevitability and bravery, rather than unpredictability and human limitation. After the men were lost, recovered diaries passed through hands that prioritized narrative coherence, selecting which words would survive and which would remain buried in archives. The journals were physically transported back to Sweden, but before publication, they were edited with intention. Certain technical details were clarified for clarity, and editorial choices were made to present a readable, compelling story for a general audience. The subtle interventions created a curated memory of the expedition, one that was no longer a raw, unfiltered account of survival and challenge, but a crafted historical document shaped by those removed from the Arctic itself. Scholars examining the edited texts noted discrepancies in dates, tone, and descriptive emphasis, suggesting that human choices, not the Arctic, had ultimately framed the story. Original diary fragments revealed moments of tension, indecision, and even humour, aspects that were softened or removed in published editions. Some passages hint at the men's awareness of danger and the limits of their technology, while others describe interpersonal dynamics that humanize the crew. These details, largely absent in early accounts, illuminate how editorial decisions shaped public perception, creating a narrative that emphasized scientific achievement and valor over uncertainty and vulnerability. Beyond the pages, the ice itself remained unyielding, recording every landing, every trek across glaciers, without regard for clarity, chronology, or legend. The Arctic landscape preserved the expedition's final traces, equipment remnants, tent fragments, and the physical imprints of movement across the frozen terrain. Unlike edited diaries, the environment retained no bias, providing evidence that could either corroborate or contradict the curated narrative. For historians and explorers, the Arctic serves as a silent arbiter, bearing witness in ways that human hands and editorial discretion cannot fully control. Through careful selection, editors had crafted a tale of bravery and inevitability, where uncertainty and frustration were minimized to suit the expectations of contemporaneous audiences. The narrative presented to the public reinforced images of ingenuity, courage, and meticulous preparation, rather than highlighting miscalculations, environmental challenges, or the psychological toll on the men. By shaping which diary entries survived and which were emphasized, human intervention created a version of events that balanced scientific interest with storytelling, ensuring that the expedition's legacy would inspire admiration, even as the full truth remained partially obscured. The tension between the men's lived experience and the narrative presented in print highlights the enduring challenge of separating fact from curated memory, even when primary sources survive. Diaries that were recovered intact may contain the precise details of daily life and decision-making, yet the public record has always reflected selective exposure. Modern researchers continue to compare original fragments with published versions, noting where editorial choices altered perception and where silence replaced explanation. In this sense, the mystery of the Andree expedition lies not only in the Arctic's frozen expanse, but in the choices humans made about what to preserve, interpret, and share. Even with every diary recovered, the Arctic continues to hold the truth of Andree's journey, beyond what human hands ever dared to reveal. The Soviet Pamir incident. Government directives had dictated every detail of the Soviet Pamir expedition, yet the resulting disaster revealed how control and human ambition can collide in unforeseen ways. The mission, framed as a demonstration of Soviet skill and international prestige, carried both scientific objectives and political expectations. From the outset, every decision, from the choice of climbers to the supplies packed, was scrutinized by officials concerned with propaganda and reputation. Yet even the most meticulous planning could not account for the combination of extreme altitude, unpredictable conditions, and human error. As the expedition unfolded, the tension between bureaucratic control and the harsh realities of high-altitude mountaineering became tragically evident. The climbers' selection was as political as it was practical, each man expected to embody skill, loyalty, and the projection of national strength. Experience in high-altitude climbs mattered, but so did ideological reliability. The men were aware that their actions would be interpreted as a reflection of state competence. Personal diaries and letters hint at pride and anxiety, though censorship limited what could be expressed openly. Every training exercise and route assessment was documented and reviewed, with the dual purpose of improving safety and demonstrating rigorous oversight. This combination of personal risk and political obligation created a precarious environment long before the expedition left base camp. Planning meetings and supply checklists were meticulously documented, yet behind closed doors, officers debated what details could be released to avoid embarrassment. Equipment inspections, route maps, and weather assessments were recorded, but any indication of vulnerability or uncertainty was systematically downplayed. Officials emphasized precision and order in internal communications, creating a framework that presented competence while masking potential weaknesses. Even decisions as simple as ration allocation or tent placement were influenced by concerns about optics, illustrating how bureaucracy is intertwined with survival. In this way, the foundation of the expedition was structured around both achievement and control, a duality that would shape every subsequent event. Communication logs suggest that the expedition quickly faced mounting difficulties, with weather, fatigue, and equipment performance testing the men's endurance and judgment. Early reports, partially reconstructed from survivor notes, describe shifting wind patterns, snow-laden slopes, and the physical toll of continuous climbing. Altitude sickness affected multiple members, yet internal reports minimized its severity. The combination of extreme conditions and tight oversight created subtle pressures. Climbers feared both personal failure and the possibility that any misstep would be noted, critiqued, or censored in later official reports. These pressures compounded ordinary hazards, turning each decision into a test of both skill and obedience. When casualties occurred, official reports emphasized procedure and order, while private accounts described sudden injuries, missteps, and moments of near panic. One climber suffered a severe fall on an icy ridge, another became disoriented during a whiteout. Yet state communications framed these incidents as contained and managed. Survivors' recollections, collected years later, hinted improvisation, fear, and debate over next steps, details absent from the official record. The contrast between the human experience of danger and the curated narrative highlights the influence of authority over truth, showing how information was shaped before it could reach the outside world. Authorities restricted access to first-hand information, altering records and delaying public disclosure in a pattern later interpreted as intentional suppression. Media coverage was delayed for months. Official bulletins omitted casualty counts, and surviving documentation was carefully reviewed before release. Any reports that might suggest incompetence or oversight failure were revised or redacted, producing a narrative that emphasized efficiency, discipline, and heroic effort. For historians, these interventions complicate reconstruction, requiring careful cross-referencing of surviving diaries, oral testimony, and fragmentary reports to approach an approximation of events. Survivors' testimonies conflicted on critical details, from the timing of accidents to the decisions that led to exposure, leaving historians with only partial narratives. One account emphasizes a sudden storm, another attributes the same event to miscalculation in route selection. Discrepancies extended to the description of equipment performance and interpersonal dynamics within the climbing team. Each version contains elements of truth, yet each is shaped by memory, censorship, and personal perspective. The challenge of reconciling these accounts illustrates the way human and political factors can blur the line between observation and narrative construction. Investigations conducted under political oversight produced heavily redacted reports, their purpose often appearing to protect the image of Soviet competence rather than illuminate the truth. Internal committees reviewed logs and testimonies, selecting which material could be included in official releases. Technical failures and environmental misjudgments were downplayed or omitted, while perseverance and discipline were highlighted. These choices ensured that the expedition would remain a symbol of national capability, even as the full circumstances of accidents, fatigue, and error remained obscured from public scrutiny. History, in this instance, was filtered through both ice and ideology. Decades later, archival research and interviews reveal fragmented evidence of what transpired, though the full sequence of events remains obscured by state interference. Scholars have pieced together weather records, climbing notes, and sporadic correspondence to establish probable timelines, yet gaps persist. The mountain's physical traces, including abandoned campsites and equipment, corroborate certain hazards, but the interplay of human error and bureaucratic manipulation complicates interpretation. Every discovery raises further questions, illustrating the dual forces of natural peril and political influence that shaped both the expedition and the records that followed. Analysis of the expedition highlights the dual forces at work, the perils inherent in high-altitude exploration and the distortion introduced by deliberate secrecy. The climbers faced extreme conditions, and yet the human story, decisions, improvisation, fear, and endurance was filtered through a lens of ideological expectation. For observers and historians, the task is not merely to reconstruct events, but to navigate the tension between environment and authority, between what happened and what was allowed to be reported. In this, the Soviet Pamir incident exemplifies a mystery born of both nature and human design. Even now, the human and political shadows surrounding the Soviet Pamir expedition obscure the truth, leaving only tantalizing hints of what really happened. The ever-changing fate of the Karluk. The Karluk set sail with ambition as its compass, yet hidden doubts about preparation and leadership would cast a shadow over every mile of its Arctic voyage. Led by Vilhjalmur Stephenson, the expedition sought both scientific discovery and national prestige, with a focus on mapping uncharted Arctic regions and studying indigenous wildlife. Publicly, the venture was framed as daring and meticulously planned, yet internal communications and later accounts hint at tensions over ship readiness, crew selection, and the hazards of untested routes. The line between calculated risk and oversight would blur as the journey unfolded, leaving questions that decades of scholarship have struggled to answer. Among the crew, tensions simmered beneath a veneer of discipline, as officers and sailors navigated both hierarchy and personal loyalties in confined quarters. Stephenson's leadership style, both charismatic and distant, left some men uncertain about authority in critical moments. Experienced ice navigators and scientists coexisted with less seasoned sailors, creating friction over responsibilities and decision-making. Letters and diaries later revealed private complaints about resource allocation, equipment choices, and the handling of extreme weather. These interpersonal dynamics, often minimized in early reports, would later influence interpretations of both the crew's actions and the expedition's ultimate failures. Early encounters with shifting sea ice demanded critical judgment, testing decisions that would later be scrutinized and debated in reports and memoirs. The Karluk struggled to maintain its course as ice flows shifted unpredictably, forcing adjustments to navigation and speed. Captain Robert Bartlett and other officers documented these maneuvers, noting strain on both men and materials. Minor miscalculations were often downplayed in official summaries, yet survivor recollections underscore that these early decisions set the stage for the disaster that would follow. In retrospect, the subtle interplay of environmental danger and human choice foreshadowed the calamity that would divide the crew and alter their fate. When the ship became trapped in pack ice, every choice, where to move, what supplies to ration, who to send on recon, took on life or death significance. The vessel drifted with the ice for weeks, and the crew had to manage scarce provisions, deteriorating equipment, and mounting psychological strain. Decisions about which members would attempt over-ice treks versus who would remain aboard were fraught with risk, revealing both ingenuity and misjudgment. Internal disagreements over priorities and routes illustrate how survival depended not solely on skill, but also on consensus, which was often elusive in extreme isolation. Each choice carried consequences that would reverberate long after the ice released its grip. As groups split from the main vessel, each faced a new reality of exposure, hunger and fatigue, their survival hinging on both judgment and chance. Bartlett led a smaller contingent seeking help across treacherous ice and snow, while others remained with the Karluk or attempted independent treks. Accounts detail frostbite, exhaustion, and perilous crossings of pressure ridges and open leads. These experiences, recorded in diaries and oral testimonies, contrast sharply with the sanitized versions published in newspapers and official bulletins. The fragmentation of the crew magnified the unpredictability of Arctic survival, illustrating that even meticulous preparation could not mitigate every hazard. News of the expedition's troubles filtered slowly to the public, and official dispatches often conflicted with first-hand impressions, generating controversy over responsibility. Reports highlighted heroic endurance and scientific achievement while downplaying delays, poor visibility, and leadership decisions that may have contributed to casualties. Journalists relied on partial statements from Stephenson and Bartlett, sometimes presenting conflicting narratives as fact. This patchwork reporting shaped early public perception, creating a tension between admiration for courage and speculation about negligence. The Karluk story, as presented contemporaneously, became both a tale of exploration and a subject of moral debate. Survivors' later accounts revealed details omitted from early reports, from desperate marches across ice to personal reflections on leadership and sacrifice. Some diaries described near-death experiences, miscommunication, and the critical role of local knowledge in survival, offering insights absent from contemporary summaries. These first-hand narratives highlighted both the human cost of Arctic exploration and the gaps left by censored or simplified official versions. Divergent recollections underscore the difficulty of reconstructing events, as memory, trauma, and editorial influence all shaped what was eventually recorded. Historians examining Stephenson's decisions weigh environmental unpredictability against human error, noting where preparation fell short and where fortune intervened. Analyses of supply inventories, ice drift patterns, and timing suggest that while miscalculations played a role, many outcomes were dictated by uncontrollable forces. Researchers debate whether certain actions, such as leaving crew members behind or underestimating ice movement, constituted negligence or unavoidable risk. The tension between chance and choice continues to dominate discussions, reinforcing the idea that Karluk's fate was a convergence of circumstance, environment, and leadership. Debates over accountability persist, shaped by incomplete records, contrasting testimony, and the need to reconcile heroism with tragedy in the public imagination. Stephenson himself avoided the ship when it became trapped, focusing on external exploration, a decision that remains contentious among scholars and commentators. Captain Bartlett received praise for leading a smaller contingent to safety, but critics questioned the wisdom of splitting the crew. Letters, memoirs, and subsequent analyses illustrate how personal perspectives and selective reporting influenced public and historical opinion. The controversy demonstrates that the story of the Karluk is as much about narrative construction as it is about Arctic survival. The story of the Karluk endures as a testament to the Arctic's indifference and the fragile narratives humans construct to explain disaster and survival. Maps, diaries, and artifacts provide fragments of truth, but the interplay of environment, decision-making, and interpretation leaves questions unresolved. Each attempt to reconstruct the expedition encounters gaps in documentation and memory, revealing both the limits of human understanding and the enduring power of the ice to obscure events. In examining these fragments, historians confront not only what happened, but how the story was told, reshaped, and remembered over time. Even after a century of study, the fate of the Karluk shifts with every account, leaving only fragments of certainty amid the drifting ice. The Franklin search expeditions that found too much. In the wake of Franklin's disappearance, fleets of search expeditions were dispatched, their crews driven by duty, ambition, and the weight of national expectation. The mystery of the lost ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, had captured public attention across Britain and Europe. Each expedition carried the dual burden of locating survivors and preserving national pride, yet few could anticipate the grim evidence they would uncover. Early reports hinted that the fate of Franklin's crew was dire, but as searches progressed, it became clear that some discoveries would challenge not only public perceptions, but also the carefully constructed narratives of Arctic heroism, unsettling both officials and the public alike. Early discoveries of abandoned camps, discarded equipment, and skeletal remains reached naval offices and explorers' journals, yet portions of these reports were deliberately muted or altered before public release. John Ray's accounts, for instance, detailed campsites stripped bare and personal items left in haste, yet official dispatches emphasised perseverance and order rather than suffering and desperation. Even maps noting the locations of human remains were sometimes omitted from public versions of the expedition's records. In this way, searchers were caught between recording reality and respecting the sensitivities of both government and society, creating a tension that would echo through history and complicate future scholarship. Eyewitness testimony varied sharply, with Inuit guides describing grim details of survival that contrasted with official dispatches emphasising perseverance and heroic endurance. These guides recounted instances of crew members succumbing to hunger, illness and exposure, painting a stark picture of Arctic survival. Such accounts often included evidence that, to contemporary sensibilities, bordered on taboo, yet they were invaluable to understanding the expedition's final days. The divergence between Inuit observations and European interpretations created a persistent gap in the historical record, leaving later researchers to reconcile what was witnessed with what was officially acknowledged and carefully framed for public consumption. Expeditions led by John Ray and other explorers uncovered evidence that challenged prevailing narratives, including skeletal remains suggesting starvation and extreme hardship. Ray reported seeing bones showing clear signs of prolonged suffering alongside artifacts indicating hurried departures from campsites. His discoveries suggested that the crew had endured weeks of dwindling provisions, forced marches across unstable ice, and difficult attempts to reach safety. Yet Ray's reports, emphasising both tragedy and the reliability of local knowledge, were met with disbelief or suppression by officials keen to maintain the image of stoic British sailors facing adversity with dignity, a narrative that increasingly conflicted with the chilling evidence emerging in the field. Personal artifacts, boots, tools and journals offered tangible proof of the crew's suffering, revealing a human story that official accounts often softened or omitted. One diary recovered described attempts to ration meagre provisions, cope with frostbite, and sustain hope under relentless Arctic conditions. Clothing left in caches, partially consumed food stores, and broken sledging equipment all provided material testimony of hardship. These objects, though seemingly mundane, carried silent witness to the crew's final efforts, exposing a reality far more harrowing than the polished reports that circulated in newspapers and Admiralty communiques, offering glimpses into the stark choices forced upon men by the ice. Governments and newspapers carefully curated what information reached the public, framing the narrative around bravery while downplaying the more disturbing realities uncovered. In Britain, there was unease at reporting evidence that might suggest cannibalism or gross misjudgment, both of which appeared in Ray's interviews with Inuit informants. Editors and officials preferred accounts emphasising heroism, discipline and loyalty, even when the material evidence told a more complicated story. This deliberate shaping of public perception illustrates how expeditions searching for one mystery could themselves become instruments in managing the story that emerged, filtering the harsh truths of Arctic survival to maintain national morale. Later expeditions faced unpredictable ice and delayed reports, uncovering additional remains and ship debris that sometimes contradicted earlier interpretations. The drift of ice floes and seasonal thawing exposed caches of supplies and skeletal remains in locations previously thought inaccessible. Surveyors documented disarrayed sledges, scattered equipment, and human remains showing signs of starvation and exposure, yet these discoveries were often noted in obscure logs or private letters rather than widely disseminated reports. Each new piece of evidence complicated earlier assumptions, creating an evolving, often unsettling picture of the Franklin expedition's final months and forcing reconsideration of what lost truly meant. Historians piecing together these findings debate whether Franklin's fate was sealed by environmental inevitability, leadership decisions, or a combination of both. The condition of recovered artifacts and skeletal remains indicates both extraordinary endurance and the severe consequences of misjudgment in planning or execution. Some argue that the crew's choices reflect rational decisions given incomplete information. Others suggest that failures in supply management or leadership exacerbated the crisis. The ongoing debate underscores the challenge of separating Arctic circumstance from human action, and how the search expeditions themselves became part of the puzzle, intertwining the fate of Franklin with those who sought him. The selective release of evidence and the reshaping of reports raise enduring questions about whether concealment was intended to protect reputations or to shield the public from unsettling truths. Admiral Sir John Franklin's name carried weight, and early revelations of death and desperation threatened national morale. Editors, naval authorities, and expedition leaders filtered the more gruesome details, ensuring that accounts emphasized courage and loyalty. This deliberate omission left later generations piecing together fragmentary truths, reliant on diaries, Inuit testimony, and recovered artifacts to glimpse what authorities at the time preferred to leave unspoken, blurring the line between discovery and deliberate silence. The search for Franklin left a legacy of Arctic exploration intertwined with moral ambiguity, where discovery and suppression existed side by side in the annals of history. Arctic expeditions following the missing ships contributed to mapping unknown regions, documenting ice patterns, and improving survival techniques. Yet they also revealed the limits of reporting and the consequences of selective disclosure. The evidence collected in the pursuit of Franklin became a story not only of lost sailors, but of how societies record, interpret, and sometimes obscure the realities of human suffering under extreme conditions, leaving historians to navigate both fact and omission. The traces left behind by those who hunted for Franklin endure as haunting fragments, hinting at truths the ice itself seems determined to conceal. The lost surveyors of the Darien Gap. When surveyors first entered the Darien Gap, their mission promised discovery, yet soon their absence sparked whispers of vanished crews and unrecovered records. The region, known for its dense jungle and near impenetrable swamplands, had long been considered a formidable obstacle to explorers and cartographers alike. Governments in Panama and neighbouring territories invested in mapping safe passages, both for trade and strategic interests, but the surveyors' sudden disappearance left authorities scrambling. Early announcements framed their absence as a temporary delay, yet local accounts hinted at far more troubling possibilities, sparking unease among those who understood the Gap's deadly reputation. Equipped with compasses, chains, and rudimentary topographical tools, the teams had trained for remote conditions, yet nothing could fully prepare them for the oppressive isolation that awaited within the Gap's endless greenery. The jungle itself proved an unforgiving adversary, with tangled vines, treacherous swamps, and relentless insects making every mile a struggle for life and documentation alike. Rivers swelled unpredictably during heavy rains, cutting off established routes and forcing survey teams to backtrack or risk being stranded. Heat, humidity, and disease compounded the physical challenges, rendering even basic navigation hazardous. Quicksand concealed itself beneath seemingly solid ground, and hidden sinkholes threatened to swallow both men and equipment without warning, transforming routine navigation into a constant gamble. The surveyor's notes described nights spent listening to the cries of unseen animals, the constant hum of insects, and the suffocating weight of foliage, emphasizing that each step forward was a negotiation with the land itself. Initial communications offered little clarity, as letters and official reports conflicted with newspaper notices and rumors circulating among local settlements. One dispatch suggested the surveyors had reached a river crossing, while another claimed their progress had stalled for weeks. Journalists speculated about ambushes, illness, or fatal accidents, but the truth remained obscured by the delay and scarcity of reliable information. This tension between official narrative and local testimony fostered a climate of uncertainty, where speculation often carried as much weight as confirmed facts, leaving historians with the difficult task of separating reality from rumour. Even the tone of local accounts reflected a community aware of the jungle's lethal reputation, which only amplified public anxiety about the missing men. Maps, sketches, and field notebooks intended to chart uncharted territory disappeared almost as quickly as the men, leaving only fragments of the routes they traversed. Surviving materials, often incomplete or damaged by the harsh environment, provided tantalizing glimpses of the terrain but lacked critical context. Surveying tools were sometimes recovered near the edges of swamps or washed-down riverbanks, suggesting both the difficulty of the work and the chaos surrounding their disappearance. Each vanished map represented not only lost geographic knowledge, but also the painstaking labour of men who had spent months tracing rivers, valleys, and ridges under the canopy's shadow. Each lost notebook or partial map became a haunting artefact, hinting at both the surveyors' progress and the dangers that claimed them before they could complete their mission. Political authorities in both Panama and colonial administrations appeared hesitant to disclose setbacks, fueling speculation that some discoveries or failures were intentionally obscured. Dispatches were delayed, and official reports often minimized losses or environmental challenges, creating a sanitized narrative of progress in the Darien Gap. Historians later suggested that the combination of diplomatic sensitivity, strategic interests, and embarrassment over failed expeditions led to selective reporting. This pattern of concealment cast a shadow over the historical record, leaving modern researchers to wonder what might have been deliberately withheld from the public eye. In some cases, it is clear that omissions were strategic, designed to protect the reputations of surveyors and officials while downplaying the jungle's lethal influence. Search parties ventured into the dense rainforest, confronting fever, venomous creatures, and near impenetrable terrain that turned even routine tracking into a perilous ordeal. Small teams sent to locate the missing surveyors often became lost themselves, relying on local guides and limited maps that could not account for seasonal flooding or shifting landscapes. Supplies ran low and disease spread quickly, forcing some searchers to turn back without reaching their intended destinations. Exhaustion and dread weighed heavily on the searchers, whose letters recount nights haunted by uncertainty and the fear that the jungle had already claimed the missing teams. These failed rescue missions only heightened the mystery, creating a chilling sense that the jungle itself resisted all attempts to map or penetrate it fully. Surviving guides and locals offered inconsistent recollections of encounters or sightings, further complicating attempts to reconstruct the surveyors' final movements. One villager might claim to have seen a small group carrying equipment through a river valley, while another insisted no outsiders had passed nearby. Language barriers and mistrust heightened these contradictions, leaving even first-hand accounts fragmented and sometimes contradictory. The human element, the fear, confusion and survival instinct of both surveyors and local witnesses added a layer of complexity to the narrative that maps and journals could never fully convey. In many ways, the very people who might have clarified the record were constrained by their own perception and memory, which were as mutable as the landscape itself. Archives reveal conspicuous absences, files destroyed, dispatches delayed, and official notes missing, leaving historians to rely on secondary sources and partial accounts. Some government offices retain only references to correspondence that is now lost, while other materials appear to have vanished without explanation. Attempts to track the surveyor's progress through official channels often led to dead ends, suggesting either mismanagement or deliberate suppression. The combination of natural hazards, political caution, and incomplete record-keeping ensured that the Darien Gap remained not only physically impenetrable but historically elusive. Scholars examining the remnants of these archives must navigate gaps that raise as many questions as they answer, creating a patchwork history of uncertainty. Each new investigation deepens the puzzle as topography, disease, and secrecy combine to erase nearly all traces of the expedition's intentions and outcomes. Modern researchers, using satellite imagery and newly recovered documents, have attempted to reconstruct the surveyor's route, yet the landscape has changed significantly over the decades. Rivers shift, vegetation reclaims cleared paths, and human settlement has altered some regions, meaning even the most careful reconstructions remain speculative. The interplay of environmental change, incomplete documentation, and conflicting accounts keeps the mystery alive, a testament to the relentless unpredictability of the gap. Every new insight reveals how little is truly known, reinforcing the sense of an unsolvable enigma. The fate of the Darien surveyors continues to resonate, a reminder of the human cost behind exploration and the fragile line between discovery and disappearance. Their work, though incomplete, contributed to later mapping efforts and highlighted the extreme challenges of charting regions resistant to human intrusion. Scholars examining the episode today recognize both the bravery of the surveyors and the limits imposed by nature, politics, and chance. Their story is one of ambition thwarted, knowledge delayed, and the enduring tension between human curiosity and the impenetrable wilds. In the jungle's shadow, the records of their endeavour remain as incomplete as the paths they sought to trace. Decades later, the vanished surveyors and their missing maps linger as silent witnesses to a jungle that refuses to yield its secrets. The Belgica's Antarctic silence. Whispers of omissions and unexplained delays haunted the Belgica's official records, suggesting that not all aspects of the Antarctic overwintering were ever meant to be revealed. Even as the ship pressed southward, preparations had been carefully documented, yet gaps in the published logs hinted at decisions, events and hardships that were intentionally muted. Crew members kept private journals that contained annotations absent from formal reports, providing hints of discontent, fear, and unrecorded crises. These silences have persisted through time, leaving historians to wonder which truths were suppressed and why some aspects of the expedition were carefully concealed from public view. The prolonged confinement tested the crew in ways that instruments could not measure, and routine tasks became battlegrounds for attention, patience, and morale. Hours spent maintaining the ship, checking scientific instruments, and recording meteorological observations were punctuated by small quarrels, suppressed frustrations, and moments of near paranoia. The inability to leave the ship, combined with the monotony of frozen seas, magnified every tension into an amplified echo. Private diaries reveal that even minor disagreements over duties or measurements could escalate under the pressure of isolation. Yet these episodes were largely absent from official accounts. Sickness arrived gradually, weakening bodies and dulling minds, yet the private journals reveal a severity that the public reports carefully downplayed. Crew members suffered from scurvy and exhaustion, and some exhibited early signs of mental deterioration as diet and sunlight deprivation took their toll. While official dispatches focused on scientific achievement and the collection of data, marginal notes describe men struggling to climb ladders, handle sledges, or complete routine maintenance. The contrast between these intimate recordings and sanitized publications suggests a deliberate attempt to present the expedition as orderly and controlled, concealing the true human cost of overwintering in the Antarctic. Adrien de Gerlach's leadership was constantly challenged by dwindling energy, fading hope, and the delicate necessity of maintaining discipline under extreme stress. Decision-making became a balancing act, rationing limited supplies, assigning exhausting tasks, and addressing disputes without exacerbating already fragile morale. Even the smallest misjudgment could provoke panic or despair, yet public reports framed these decisions as prudent and measured. Letters between officers and scientists hint at the strain of commanding men whose physical and mental reserves were failing, and suggest moments when de Gerlach's authority was quietly questioned within the crew. Several entries were redacted or left unpublished, leaving gaps that obscure the most intimate accounts of fear, conflict, and fleeting moments of despair. Some journals were later retrieved, revealing brief annotations about arguments, accidental injuries, and nights when sleep was impossible. The act of omitting these passages from circulation created an official narrative that appeared orderly and uneventful, masking the continuous tension that shaped daily life aboard the ship. Historians now consider these omissions central to understanding the expedition's psychological complexity and the pressures exerted by extreme isolation. Psychological strain grew alongside physical decline, producing subtle tension, whispered disputes, and signs of mental instability that only surface in marginal notes. Crew members reported feelings of disorientation, irritability, and fleeting hallucinations, occasionally noting them in pencil along the edges of pages. These annotations, often cryptic or fragmentary, provide glimpses of the interior life of men trapped in months of darkness, revealing the human consequences of being cut off from the outside world. They hint at the accumulation of stress, the slow erosion of certainty, and the fragile boundary between disciplined routine and disorder. Communications with European authorities were filtered and incomplete, creating an official narrative that differed sharply from what the crew endured daily. Reports were delayed for months, often omitting references to illness or near-fatal incidents, presenting an image of steady progress and scientific diligence. Contemporary newspapers published these filtered reports, leaving the public with an incomplete, almost sanitized impression of the expedition. The gap between reality and representation underscores the persistent tension between discovery, personal survival and institutional reputation, revealing how expeditions often exist simultaneously in two worlds, the one experienced and the one recorded. Historians piecing together the censored and surviving documents have uncovered fragments of near breakdowns, contested decisions, and episodes deliberately minimized or omitted. Letters, sketches, and notebooks recovered decades later provide corroborating evidence for what was hinted at in private annotations. These materials allow scholars to reconstruct aspects of the overwintering that were previously unknown, including how the crew's daily routines were reshaped by illness, fatigue, and fear. Yet even with these reconstructions, vast portions of the Belgica's internal narrative remain speculative, leaving lingering questions about what was truly endured during the long Antarctic night. Many questions about the Belgica's overwintering remain unanswered, leaving historians and readers alike to navigate a story partly recorded, partly erased. Precise details about the progression of disease, the full impact of isolation on mental health, and the choices made behind closed doors remain elusive. Each surviving page offers tantalizing glimpses of strain and resilience, yet the fragmented nature of these accounts ensures that some truths may never emerge. The expedition's legacy is therefore dual, celebrated for scientific milestones yet haunted by the incompleteness of its internal record, leaving the human experience of Antarctic isolation partially hidden. Despite notable scientific discoveries, the hidden struggles and human cost endured in silence continue to shadow the expedition's legacy. Maps, meteorological records, and biological specimens testify to the crew's diligence, but the margins of journals whisper of tension, fear, and the long shadows cast by darkness and cold. Every suppressed entry, every redacted note, suggests an enduring tension between achievement and human vulnerability. The story of the Belgica is a testament to the complexity of exploration, where success and suffering intertwine, and where silence often conceals more than any logbook can reveal. The Belgica's hidden records remain a frozen testament to a winter whose full story has never been allowed to reach the world. The Ural Mountains Geological Expedition. The expedition into the Ural Mountains began with meticulous planning, yet almost immediately anomalies in reports and missing entries hinted that some discoveries were never intended for public record. Official documents recorded surveys, mineral samples, and geological mapping, but gaps in field notes and unexplained edits suggested that certain observations were quietly excised. Personal diaries later revealed cryptic remarks about unusual rock formations and unrecorded events, hinting that the team had stumbled upon findings that exceeded scientific or political expectations. These early inconsistencies created an undercurrent of unease, raising questions about what the expedition truly encountered beneath the mountain slopes. Dense forests, jagged ridges, and hidden ravines forced geologists to navigate terrain that obscured both landmarks and the movements of their own colleagues, heightening unease. Pathways often ended abruptly at sheer cliffs or dense undergrowth, forcing the men to backtrack or reroute with little warning. Mapping instruments occasionally registered unusual readings that were dismissed in later summaries, yet diaries and letters suggested they captured anomalies the official narrative avoided. The isolation of the region amplified every uncertainty. Missteps, missing equipment, and unexpected geological formations created an environment in which suspicion thrived as much as discovery. Field instruments vanished without explanation, and 2 team members failed to return from short surveys, their absence noted only in marginal scribbles later removed from official documentation. Search parties combed dense valleys and riverbeds, but no trace of the men or their instruments was ever recovered. Reports presented these losses as minor, or attributed them to miscommunication, yet personal writings hinted at more troubling circumstances. Some entries referenced strange sounds echoing through the forest and sudden changes in topography, details absent from formal accounts. The silence surrounding these disappearances left the remaining geologists unsettled and hesitant to record further observations. Among the rocks and sediment they examined were formations whose composition suggested unprecedented mineral deposits, yet these findings were downplayed or omitted from reports circulated outside the expedition. Certain layers contained unusually concentrated metals and rare compounds that could have strategic value, but official bulletins referred only to standard geological strata. Diaries contained sketches and chemical notations that never appeared in public releases, hinting that the geologists themselves recognized the sensitivity of their discoveries. The tension between recording scientific truth and adhering to imposed censorship became a daily struggle, shaping both the work performed and the documentation that survived. Government authorities exerted subtle but relentless pressure, dictating which observations could be recorded and which should be left in the shadows, creating a climate of secrecy and fear. The expedition was funded under strict oversight, and reports were subject to multiple levels of review before leaving the field. Some letters describe meetings with officials who questioned the relevance or safety of certain data, implying that knowledge itself could be treated as dangerous. The team became acutely aware that their research might be evaluated not only for its scientific merit, but for its political implications, influencing what was documented and what was deliberately omitted. As the team pressed deeper into the mountains, tensions rose, suspicion and mistrust grew with every unexplained disappearance and conflicting instruction, eroding collaboration. Field parties grew cautious, questioning the motives of colleagues and the reliability of each map or reading. Journals hint at whispered conversations in which geologists speculated whether certain losses were accidents or intentional, though no proof was ever recorded. Even routine tasks became sources of anxiety. Collecting samples, noting elevations, or observing mineral anomalies carried the unspoken question of whether the findings were safe to record. Fear and uncertainty shadowed every decision. Decades later, fragments of notebooks and partial photographs surfaced, hinting at both the discoveries and the inexplicable losses, yet no complete record of the expedition's work survives. Modern researchers have painstakingly reconstructed aspects of the survey, identifying areas of high mineral concentration and confirming the rough path of the team. Yet missing pages, erased annotations, and the absence of certain members leave critical gaps in the story. Analysis of surviving sketches shows anomalies inconsistent with publicly released findings, indicating deliberate omission and reinforcing the sense that the full truth remains buried within the mountains themselves. Surviving personal accounts conflicted sharply with sanitized official reports, revealing omissions, contradictions, and hints of incidents never formally acknowledged. Letters recalled heated arguments over which samples should be collected, who should be trusted to transport instruments, and which observations might provoke scrutiny from authorities. Some geologists suggested abandoning notes on sensitive discoveries altogether, fearing repercussions. These discrepancies between personal accounts and official narratives highlight not only the human pressures of the expedition, but also how institutional oversight reshaped the story that eventually reached the public. The fate of missing geologists and the ultimate suppression of certain findings remain unresolved, leaving historians and scientists to piece together a story only half told. Scholars debate whether the disappearances were accidental, related to political intervention, or somehow tied to the very discoveries that were censored. Fragmented records indicate both mundane explanations and more mysterious possibilities, but no definitive conclusions have ever emerged. The expedition's secrecy casts a long shadow, and every recovered fragment of data raises new questions rather than providing closure, deepening the sense of an unsolved and carefully concealed mystery. Though the expedition contributed to geological knowledge of the Urals, the unanswered questions and suppressed materials cast a persistent shadow over its achievements. Rock formations were catalogued, mineral maps refined, and scientific techniques tested, yet the incomplete narrative leaves an eerie impression that discovery and danger were inseparably linked. The human story behind the work, loss, fear, and silent observation, remains only partially visible through the fragments left behind. In this case, achievement and secrecy entwine so closely that understanding one fully may be impossible without confronting the other. The Ural Mountains still guard the expedition's untold discoveries, leaving only fragments of truth scattered among shadows and stone. The Everest Chinese ascent controversy. Claims of a successful Chinese summit on Everest sparked immediate debate as discrepancies between official reports and eyewitness accounts raised doubts about the ascent's veracity. Observers noted that the expedition's timeline conflicted with other mountaineers' reports, while selective media coverage emphasized achievement over detail. This controversy mirrored earlier high-altitude disputes, where verification relied heavily on photographic evidence, summit logs, and base camp witness statements. The lack of independent oversight at critical moments left gaps that could never be fully reconciled. Even among experienced climbers, questions lingered about the true conditions faced on the final push, the reliability of official accounts, and whether all climbers genuinely reached the peak. The climbers themselves were highly experienced, yet the logistics of the expedition, supplies, oxygen management, and route planning exposed vulnerabilities that were rarely acknowledged in public statements. Preparing for Everest requires not only physical endurance but precise timing for rotations between camps and careful oxygen rationing. Each member's acclimatization schedule was meticulously recorded, yet subtle differences between logs and radio reports suggested last-minute adjustments that were not publicly explained. Navigating the Khumbu Icefall and the Lhotse Face demands coordination under extreme fatigue, and minor delays can cascade into hours of lost time. Even a single misstep with oxygen or rope teams could jeopardize summit success, raising questions about whether official reports overstated completion. Official summit logs presented precise timings, but rival expeditions noted inconsistencies in ascent schedules and conflicting entries that fueled speculation about the true sequence of events. Reports indicated the entire team reached the summit in a single hour, yet base camp and satellite observations suggested climbers were seen descending in smaller groups at varying times. Unexpected weather changes, including sudden snow gusts and shifting temperatures, may have caused delays that were smoothed over in official accounts. These inconsistencies, though small individually, collectively undermined confidence in the record. Mountaineering historians continue to analyse these discrepancies, weighing them against protocols for documenting summit attempts and considering the high-altitude conditions that make precise timing nearly impossible. Photographs purportedly taken at the summit drew scrutiny. Shadows, angles, and background features seemed inconsistent with Everest's known topography, prompting questions about authenticity. Some images appeared to show the climbers standing at a ridge inconsistent with nearby landmarks. Lighting anomalies, including unusually short shadows and sudden changes in snow contrast, led analysts to suggest staging or selective presentation. Climbers and photographers familiar with Everest's high-altitude photography noted that camera distortion and limited daylight could account for some oddities, yet not all anomalies were easily explained. The uncertainty surrounding these images became a central pillar of debate, reinforcing the impression that the summit documentation may not have fully reflected reality. Observers at base camp and neighbouring camps reported seeing parts of the team at unexpected times, challenging the official narrative of who reached the summit and when. One expedition member recalled hearing voices on the South Col Ridge hours earlier than reported, while another described seeing climbers descend through a section of the icefall later than official logs suggested. These reports were anecdotal, never formally recorded, but they circulated widely among mountaineers and journalists, adding fuel to the controversy. The contradictions highlighted the difficulty of coordinating high-altitude teams under extreme conditions, as well as the challenge of verifying movements in terrain where a single misstep or delayed sighting can create lasting uncertainty. Authorities overseeing the expedition maintained tight control over information, editing reports and restricting access to logs, heightening suspicion of deliberate obfuscation. Only partial field notes were released, and interviews with climbers were carefully managed, limiting first-hand testimony. Observers reported that certain details about equipment usage and route deviations were intentionally withheld, likely to maintain a controlled narrative. Even within the team, disagreements existed about how much to disclose publicly, revealing internal tensions. The combination of restricted documentation and selective reporting contributed to a sense that official accounts prioritize perception over full transparency, leaving a void filled by speculation. International media coverage alternated between praise and skepticism, highlighting gaps in documentation and amplifying contradictions between the climbers' claims and independent observations. Western mountaineering journals dissected every discrepancy, while state-affiliated Chinese outlets emphasized national achievement and technical success. Online forums and early investigative reports drew attention to inconsistencies in summit photographs, oxygen usage, and timing, fueling debate among enthusiasts and experts alike. This polarization reflected not only the technical difficulty of the climb, but also the broader stakes of national prestige. turning Everest into a stage where evidence, narrative, and perception clashed in equal measure. Scientific records, including oxygen usage, weather readings, and photographic timestamps, provided partial verification, yet left unresolved gaps that prevented definitive confirmation. Detailed logs showed expected oxygen consumption patterns for climbers at 8,800 meters, but small deviations could indicate either inefficiency, environmental stress, or misreporting. Weather data suggested windows of favorable conditions, but the timing of summit attempts raised questions about whether the team had fully exploited these periods. Even GPS readings, considered highly reliable today, were incomplete or inconsistent, leaving historians and mountaineers alike to weigh probabilities rather than certainties. The partial evidence both corroborated and contradicted the official story, sustaining long-term ambiguity. Years later, the controversy remains alive among mountaineering communities, historians, and journalists, each interpretation reinforcing the uncertainty surrounding the ascent. Analysts continue to scrutinize summit photographs, compare climbing logs, and study satellite imagery to reconcile conflicting evidence. Debates rage over whether the ascent was genuine, partially staged, or exaggerated for political acclaim. Some climbers maintain personal accounts that contradict official records, while others argue that extreme altitude and oxygen deprivation render minor discrepancies understandable. The story has become a touchstone for discussions about how achievement is verified in extreme environments and how institutional oversight can shape perception. The expedition's disputed summit continues to challenge assumptions about achievement, evidence, and the pressures of national prestige in extreme exploration. Beyond the immediate controversy, the ascent raises questions about the ethics of verification, the role of media in shaping public perception, and the limits of human endurance at 8,800 meters. Later expeditions have faced heightened scrutiny, with climbers aware that documentation, GPS data, and photographs will be carefully analysed. In this context, Everest is not just a mountain but a proving ground for credibility, where ambition and documentation collide, and where every record carries weight far beyond the summit itself. The peak may have been touched, or it may remain a story of ambition and uncertainty, but Everest alone knows what truly transpired. The Taurus Strait mapping mission. Reports of missing survey logs in the Taurus Strait have baffled historians for more than a century, hinting that the mission's findings were never fully disclosed. Naval records, personal journals, and expedition notes reference charts that were incomplete, damaged, or absent, leaving gaps in what should have been one of the most meticulously documented surveying projects of its era. While the official purpose was straightforward, mapping reefs, shoals, and navigable channels, the lack of complete documentation has fueled speculation that some discoveries were suppressed or altered. Even decades later, cartographers and maritime historians note inconsistencies in early maps, suggesting that the mission's true course and outcomes may have been obscured before public release, leaving an enduring puzzle. The Taurus Strait presented hazards unlike any other. Its channels twisted unpredictably among hundreds of small islands, tides surged with alarming speed, and reefs lay hidden beneath deceptively calm waters. For mariners and surveyors alike, a single miscalculation could prove disastrous, potentially grounding ships or sending crews into peril. The expedition carried compasses, sextants, chronometers, and tide gauges, tools capable of remarkable precision but vulnerable to the region's sudden squalls, high humidity, and shifting currents. Even experienced sailors recognized that measurements could be rendered inaccurate by environmental extremes, yet the expectation was that their records would be flawless, creating a tension between human limitation and institutional demand for exactitude. Preparation for the mission was exhaustive and meticulous. Surveyors trained in coastal triangulation, practiced celestial navigation, and rehearsed emergency procedures for storms, capsizes, and tropical diseases. Supplies were carefully calculated for months at sea, including sensitive instruments prone to damage from salt water and heat. Despite these precautions, fatigue and stress were constant companions. Crews spent long hours maneuvering small boats over treacherous channels, often under unrelenting sun or in sudden downpours. Instruments slipped from hands, compasses became unreliable, and even small errors in plotting could shift the location of reefs by miles, demonstrating that human skill alone could not fully overcome the region's natural challenges. Early anomalies quickly raised suspicion. Portions of charts were smudged, ink blurred by rain, and some notes were missing or only partially legible. Sketches occasionally suggested land formations that did not exist, while other entries contradicted measurements from nearby points. In private journals, the expedition commander noted that certain areas were impossible to reconcile. Yet, these observations never appeared in official reports. This combination of missing data, smudged pages, and conflicting observations created a persistent tension. Were these discrepancies merely accidental, the inevitable product of working in such a challenging environment, or were they intentionally concealed before publication to protect the team's reputation or institutional interests? Eyewitness accounts from local mariners and indigenous navigators deepen the mystery. Multiple reports describe survey vessels in positions inconsistent with official charts, including boats observed near reefs or in channels not recorded in any surviving logs. One account recalled seeing surveyors taking measurements in a location officially deemed impassable, while another mentioned instruments being hauled ashore in areas omitted from maps. These testimonies, though anecdotal and never formally corroborated, persisted for decades and suggested that the official documentation did not fully capture the expedition's activities, leaving historians to wonder whether knowledge was lost, ignored, or deliberately suppressed. Institutional oversight amplified the uncertainty. Colonial authorities exercised strict control over the flow of information, reviewing logs, approving charts, and occasionally editing or censoring details they deemed sensitive. Letters between naval administrators reveal concern over the mission's credibility and the potential for embarrassment if inaccuracies became public. Some records were withheld entirely, likely due to fears that navigational errors could jeopardize shipping or reflect poorly on the officers involved. This selective reporting created a sanitized version of events, presenting an orderly, precise survey while obscuring the challenges, mistakes, and unusual observations that defined much of the actual work. The consequences of missing or altered information were significant. Later expeditions encountered unexpected reefs, misaligned channels, and dangerous currents that should have been documented. Teams retraced routes, often putting themselves at risk to verify what the original mission had ostensibly surveyed. Such repeated surveys suggest systemic problems in early cartographic work, where ambition, pressure for recognition, and institutional oversight may have overshadowed accuracy. The original mission, celebrated at the time for its technical skill, inadvertently left behind a map that required reinterpretation and correction, creating a mystery that would endure well into the modern era. Technical analysis of the surviving charts offers tantalizing clues. Triangulation lines sometimes fail to converge precisely, tide tables show minor but consequential anomalies, and the placement of islands occasionally conflicts with topographical reality. Some researchers suggest that simplifications or omissions were intentional, either to streamline reporting or to protect sensitive information, while others argue that environmental factors, instrument limitations, or human error could fully account for the discrepancies. These subtleties demonstrate how minor deviations can compound into larger uncertainties, leaving a permanent ambiguity about the expedition's findings and intentions. Even today, the Taurus Strait mapping mission fascinates historians, cartographers, and maritime scholars. Journals, partial maps, and archived correspondence are examined in painstaking detail, yet inconsistencies persist. Conflicting interpretations range from benign miscalculation to deliberate concealment, each supported by fragments of evidence. Modern researchers continue to compare surviving notes with independent surveys and local knowledge, yet a definitive account remains elusive. The persistence of these questions underscores the challenge of reconstructing events in remote, dynamic environments, where human ambition, environmental unpredictability, and institutional control intersect to obscure truth. Ultimately, the human element looms over the mission's legacy. Ambition, error, and perhaps intentional secrecy all shaped the expedition's records, producing a partial story of exploration that is as revealing as it is incomplete. Surveyors worked under extreme conditions, faced intense scrutiny from authorities, and navigated waters where the margin for error was perilously thin. Their story survives in fragments, torn journals, incomplete maps, and anecdotal reports that hint at discoveries never fully disclosed. The mission is a reminder that in exploration, what is recorded may reflect not only what was observed, but also what was deemed permissible to reveal, leaving mysteries that persist long after the voyage has ended. The Taurus Strait still guards its secrets, and the full truth of the mapping mission may remain submerged beneath its shifting channels for centuries to come. The Patagonian Icefield Survey. The first sight of the Patagonian icefield left the surveyors in a state of quiet disbelief, its vast white expanse stretching beyond the horizon, fractured by hidden crevasses and jagged peaks. Reports and journals hint that even the most experienced explorers were overwhelmed by the scale, often unsure of their bearings amidst the shifting ice. Yet amid this daunting beauty, the expedition's most enduring mystery emerged. Crucial survey notes, charts, and observations were incomplete or entirely missing, leaving gaps that would puzzle historians and cartographers for decades. While the official record depicted a precise mapping effort, the surviving fragments suggest a more chaotic reality. The mission itself was meticulously planned. Surveyors carried sextants, theodolites, measuring chains, and chronometers, all intended to produce exact measurements of glaciers, passes, and waterways. Their objective was not only to chart the icefield for navigation, but also to provide data on glacial movement, ice thickness, and seasonal changes. Preparations included training in triangulation and observation under extreme cold, but the instruments, while precise on paper, were vulnerable to frost, wind, and moisture. These technical ambitions, combined with the icefield's unpredictability, created an environment where even minor errors could render entire datasets unreliable. Weather conditions compounded the difficulties. Sudden storms could obliterate visibility within minutes, while blizzards scoured the ice, shifting snowdrifts that had previously served as reference points. Crevasses opened silently, swallowing tents or instruments, and temperatures plunged well below freezing even in the summer months. Surveyors' diaries recount moments when the ground beneath them seemed to move, as ice flows shifted imperceptibly, making measured lines impossible to verify. In some instances, equipment froze solid, ink in logbooks became unreadable, and instruments warped under pressure, creating records that were at best partial, at worst unintelligible. Some anomalies were noted almost immediately. Pages smudged from damp gloves, chronometer readings that contradicted celestial observations, and sketches of passes that no subsequent expedition could locate suggest that vital data had been lost or misrecorded. Letters sent to headquarters hint at frustration and uncertainty, though these were often omitted from the official account. The surviving fragments reveal tensions between the desire for accuracy and the necessity of survival. Surveyors were forced to choose between continuing measurements in dangerous conditions or retreating to safety, sometimes abandoning instruments and notes in the process. Local guides and indigenous knowledge offered additional insight, though these contributions were seldom fully incorporated into official reports. Eyewitnesses recalled survey teams maneuvering through crevassed terrain that later appeared unmarked on published charts. One guide noted that surveyors had recorded a small lake in a location that subsequent maps did not acknowledge, while another remembered paths through glacial moraines that were absent in any surviving logs. Such discrepancies suggest that either observations were intentionally withheld or that extreme environmental conditions made accurate documentation nearly impossible. Institutional pressures may have played a role in shaping the records that did survive. Correspondence between the expedition leaders and governmental authorities reveals concern over the mission's credibility and a reluctance to publish data that might appear inconsistent. Some charts were edited, lines simplified, and anomalies glossed over, potentially to preserve the expedition's reputation or to avoid questions about navigational hazards. The combination of lost notes, environmental challenges, and administrative oversight left a sanitized record that emphasized completeness, while obscuring the expedition's uncertainties and difficulties. Human factors also contributed to the incomplete legacy. Surveyors worked long days in isolation, often exposed to wind, cold, and exhaustion that impaired judgment and precision. Frostbite, fatigue, and the psychological stress of navigating an unending white landscape led to errors and omissions in logbooks. Observers noted that instruments were occasionally dropped or misread, triangulation points lost to snowdrifts, and calculations deferred until conditions allowed for verification. By the time teams returned to base camps, many measurements were no longer recoverable, leaving a patchwork of data that complicated both official reporting and later reinterpretations. Analysis of the surviving charts highlights the ambiguity that has fueled speculation. Triangulation points sometimes fail to intersect as expected. Glaciers are placed inconsistently relative to fixed landforms, and tide tables occasionally record improbable fluctuations. Scholars examining these anomalies debate whether they reflect intentional obfuscation, human error, or genuine unpredictability in glacial and environmental conditions. Some argue that discrepancies indicate knowledge withheld for political or institutional reasons, while others suggest that the icefield's dynamic nature made absolute precision impossible, leaving a legacy that blends mystery and scientific challenge. The expedition's influence endured long after the teams returned. Later, explorers relied on partial maps, corrected charts, and fragmented notes, sometimes retracing dangerous routes to verify observations. Misplaced passes and unseen crevasses posed threats that subsequent expeditions struggled to navigate, demonstrating that the mystery of the original survey extended its consequences far beyond the initial mission. In these gaps, the Patagonian icefield remained both a subject of study and an enigma, as researchers attempted to reconcile surviving evidence with local knowledge, contemporary accounts, and modern mapping technology. Ultimately, the story of the Patagonian Icefield Survey is a collision of human ambition, environmental extremity, and institutional oversight. Surveyors faced some of the harshest conditions on the planet, working with tools that could be both precise and fragile, while authorities sought records that presented order and accuracy. The surviving fragments hint at discoveries obscured or lost, while the ice itself continues to shift, erode, and conceal evidence. This combination ensures that the survey remains a cautionary tale of how exploration, data, and human limitation intersect in the most unforgiving landscapes. The glaciers of Patagonia still guard their secrets, and the full scope of what the surveyors witnessed may lie hidden beneath the ice for generations. The Siberian Tunguska follow-ups that stopped. A sudden, almost imperceptible shock had levelled vast tracts of Siberian forest, leaving a silent scar that hinted at a force beyond ordinary understanding. Eyewitnesses from surrounding villages described a flash of light followed by a rolling wave that flattened trees in a radial pattern, yet no crater was found and the exact cause remained elusive. When early scientific expeditions finally approached the area, they encountered a landscape that seemed to defy conventional reasoning, as if nature itself had been reshaped in a single, incomprehensible moment. What was meant to be a straightforward geological investigation quickly became an exercise in both observation and speculation. Early scientific teams trudged through snow and mud, carrying instruments designed to capture magnetic anomalies, tree deformation patterns, and soil peculiarities, unsure if the terrain would allow their work at all. Among these were botanists cataloguing species that had survived the blast, geologists mapping soil disturbances, and physicists attempting to measure subtle shifts in the local geomagnetic field. The journey required weeks of preparation. Sledges were packed with tools, tents, and provisions, yet the sheer isolation of the Tunguska region meant that every measurement could be compromised by the unpredictable environment. Even before reaching the epicenter, the expeditioners understood they were entering a zone where ordinary rules of terrain and logistics could falter. Swollen rivers and dense undergrowth forced explorers to navigate by intuition and improvisation, often adding days to already grueling schedules and straining both stamina and equipment. Canoes capsized in the fast-flowing tributaries, and paths through the underbrush twisted unexpectedly, forcing scientists to backtrack repeatedly. The dense Siberian taiga obscured landmarks, making it nearly impossible to maintain precise records of distances travelled. Despite meticulous planning, each new obstacle became a reminder that nature itself could hinder the collection of knowledge, and that any attempt to fully document the site would be a battle against both geography and time. Surveyors meticulously noted the radial felling of trees, documented small scorch marks on the ground, and gathered soil samples that defied conventional explanations, recording every detail with growing unease. Tree trunks lay broken like matchsticks, often stripped of branches and scorched at their bases. Some soil samples contained unusually high levels of silica, while other sections appeared strangely compacted, as if compressed by an enormous invisible force. Observers were baffled. While nothing suggested a crater of typical impact size, the scale of destruction seemed far greater than any forest fire or ordinary meteorite. The site presented contradictions that frustrated even the most seasoned scientists. Despite their diligence, key observations were inexplicably absent. Sketches lacked scale, logs contained unexplained gaps, and maps were simplified in ways that obscured critical information. Journal pages were found with notes torn or missing, and some photographs were poorly labelled or absent. The reasons remain unclear, whether due to misfortune, oversight, or deliberate omission, and this absence of data would later haunt attempts to reconstruct the event. For those who visited the site, the gaps were unsettling. Every measurement recorded felt provisional, every sketch incomplete, as if the forest itself were resisting comprehension. State authorities imposed restrictions on the reporting and publication of findings, creating a layer of uncertainty over what the expeditions could disclose and possibly influencing which anomalies were officially acknowledged. Permits were often delayed, and scientific communications were sometimes intercepted or censored. Researchers noted that preliminary reports were heavily edited, emphasizing logistical difficulties and meteorological data, while minimizing observations of unusual magnetic disturbances or tree anomalies. This bureaucratic interference added a sense of tension, suggesting that the Tunguska site was not only a scientific challenge, but also a politically sensitive subject whose mysteries might never be fully documented. Extreme cold, hunger, and exhaustion took their toll on surveyors, leaving instruments idle and notebooks partially completed, while frostbite and illness further compromised the integrity of the records. Nights in unheated tents combined with inadequate food supplies meant that even the most meticulous observer sometimes recorded only fragments of data. Instruments frozen or damaged by exposure left critical measurements incomplete, and the isolation of the region prevented rapid resupply or repair. These human factors compounded the already formidable natural obstacles, ensuring that the Tunguska follow-ups were vulnerable to both environmental and physical limitations. Subsequent expeditions in the years that followed were delayed, redirected, or abruptly cancelled, with no clear explanation, leaving a tantalizing void in the timeline of Tunguska investigations. Some teams reached the area only to find previous markers missing or altered, and others never left their staging points, citing bureaucratic restrictions or unexplained hazards. Even decades later, attempts to return to the site faced administrative hurdles, as if an unseen force, whether human or natural, actively prevented a complete account from being assembled. Each aborted expedition left questions unanswered, contributing to the enduring aura of mystery surrounding the event. Scientists and historians have debated whether the missing and incomplete records resulted from environmental challenges, human error, or intentional suppression, but the combination of these factors only deepens the enigma. Theories range from ordinary meteorite impacts distorted by terrain to rare atmospheric explosions, yet no explanation fully reconciles the physical evidence with the incomplete documentation. The interplay of harsh geography, unpredictable weather, and political oversight ensured that the Tunguska site would resist clear interpretation, leaving even the most rigorous scientific minds with unanswered questions about what truly occurred. The site remained a labyrinth of half-recorded observations, unexplained phenomena, and unanswered questions, resisting full understanding despite decades of renewed interest. Modern researchers have returned equipped with satellite imaging, dendrochronology, and chemical analysis, yet the historical interruptions and lost original notes prevent any definitive reconstruction. Every discovery seems to raise further ambiguities, emphasizing how much of the original event and its subsequent investigation remains shrouded by circumstance, oversight, and mystery. Beneath the Siberian canopy, the unanswered questions of Tunguska linger, as if the forest itself guards the truth of why no follow-up ever fully captured what struck in 1908. The lost logs of Shackleton's Ross Sea Party. The bitter winds of Antarctica claimed more than bodies and supplies during the Ross Sea Party's ordeal. Voices that should have been heard for generations were swallowed, leaving behind tantalizing gaps that have fueled whispers of missing accounts and possible cover-up. The Ross Sea Party was a supporting wing of Sir Ernest Shackleton's Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition, tasked with laying supply depots across the Ross ice shelf so Shackleton's transcontinental crossing might succeed. Their story became an odd footnote to the heroic saga of Endurance's survival, and as the depot-laying party trudged through blizzard and starvation, what returned to the world was only a fragment of what had been put to paper. When the Aurora steamed southward from Sydney in December 1914 carrying the Ross Sea Party, the men were confident their meticulous preparation would produce a trove of data and narrative worth publishing. Maps and weather logs might advance polar science and secure their place in the annals of exploration. On reaching McMurdo Sound, the party laid the groundwork for months of depot work. Men like Andrew Keith Jack recorded routine observations day by day, filling volumes with the measured rise and fall of temperature, the character of the winds, and the beat of sea ice against an iron hull. Even his careful accounts leave shadows where pages should be, blank stretches that hint at pauses in writing or fragments that never returned from the ice. Disaster struck not on the sledging journeys but at the very edge of their base. The Aurora, moored precariously off Hut Point, was ripped from her cables by a gale in May 1915, leaving the shore party marooned with minimal supplies and no immediate means of communication with the outside world. That betrayal by the sea was recorded with stark understatement in surviving diaries, yet some of the most detailed accounts of the ship's final hours and the crew's struggle were nowhere to be found in public archives. Manuscripts were lost to time or quietly tucked away, leaving historians to piece the narrative together from fragments. Among those lost or fragmented was the leader Aeneas Mackintosh's diary, presumed taken aboard the drifting Aurora as it yawed in pack ice. His account might have shed light on command decisions and the psychological toll of isolation. What remains are second-hand references in other men's notes and occasional clippings from incomplete journals, enough to confirm his resolute efforts to hold the party's spirit together, but not enough to provide a continuous first-hand account of what he saw and thought during that critical drift. The tragedy deepened on the sledging journeys of the second season as the party pressed onward to complete their depot mission. Every man's body bent under weight, scurvy creeping through limbs and hope dwindling with each passing day. Among them was Arnold Spencer Smith, a clergyman whose diary entries shift from scientific observation to personal reflection. His final entry, dated just days before his death in March 1916, survives in museum collections, a precious document of this grim feat. Yet even it raises questions. The silence between entries, the missing explanatory notes, leaves gaps that have never been accounted for in the expedition's published narrative. Victor Hayward's journal offers another perspective, intensely personal as he wrote principally for the loved ones he had left behind. He catalogued weather, moods, and the steady erosion of hope as the Antarctic night deepened. Portions of his work are absent from public collections, referenced by archivists but never released for broader scholarly review. This absence prompts speculation that some narratives were considered too subjective or too raw to enter official Antarctic historiography, leaving readers with an incomplete impression of his experience. Keith Jack's volumes stand as the most complete surviving set. Rediscovered in the mid to 20th century, they became the basis for renewed study of the Ross Sea Party's scientific contributions, from meteorology to glaciology. Yet the very survival of these works underscores how precarious the expedition's documentary record was, as if fate sought to rob posterity of the full truth. The ice seemed to claim not only bodies but also the men's words, leaving fragments and echoes of a story that should have been whole. The return of some records decades later only deepened the mystery of those that never surfaced. While multiple diaries appeared through archives, descendants, and private collections, others lingered only in tantalizing references, never materializing in any public repository. The gaps persist in polar history, hinted at in footnotes and abrupt manuscript endings. Scholars are forced to reconstruct events that the authors themselves might have intended to articulate fully, leaving enduring questions about the party's true experiences. Even as Shackleton South recounts the grandeur and sorrow of the larger expedition, the voices of the Ross Sea Party were muted or condensed. Excerpts hint at triumph and tragedy alike, but never present a complete chronicle. Some journals assumed lost have since surfaced in fragments, while others remain undisclosed or unlocated. The cumulative effect is uncanny, as though the ice itself took deliberate toll on the record, withholding details of human endurance and suffering from the historical record. There is a solemn beauty in the known diaries of the Ross Sea Party. Each entry offers a glimpse of human endurance under impossible conditions. Yet the silence where missing pages should be becomes an echo of Antarctica's vast emptiness. It is a stark reminder that some truths about their ordeal and suffering may never be recovered. And somewhere, buried in an archive or lost to the drifting ice, there may still be a journal that would change everything we think we know about the Ross Sea Party's fight for survival. The Mount Ararat survey that went classified. Rugged slopes of Mount Ararat have long hidden secrets, yet one scientific survey vanished from public record, leaving questions that remain unanswered. Even as maps and expedition logs circulated briefly, official files later sealed much of the work, sparking speculation about why a routine geological survey would be treated with unusual secrecy. The mountain itself rises sharply above the Anatolian plain, its twin summits often shrouded in snow and clouds, creating a natural barrier between explorers and the outside world. For decades, researchers have noted that the survey's findings are referenced only in passing in some papers, yet the majority of the data seems to have disappeared, leaving an unusual void in the geological history of the region. Surveyors equipped with specialized instruments navigated ice, scree and volcanic rock, tasked with documenting terrain features with precise measurements. Their objectives included measuring glacier thickness, mapping ridge lines, and cataloguing geological formations thought to be remnants of ancient volcanic activity. Some team members carried barometers, theodolites, and early photogrammetry equipment, allowing them to capture elevations and landscape features with painstaking accuracy. Official correspondence instructed the team to prioritize precision, yet it also contained vague warnings about information that must remain restricted. The combination of scientific rigor and bureaucratic oversight created an undercurrent of tension between fieldwork and administrative control, a tension that would later manifest in missing or classified documents. Storms swept across high ridges, forcing field teams to adapt quickly, while some recorded observations mysteriously never reached official archives. Blizzards and sudden temperature drops challenged even the most experienced surveyors, compelling them to leave partial notes or postpone measurements indefinitely. In several cases, notebooks later submitted to national repositories were incomplete, with pages torn or sections deliberately removed. Scholars examining these fragments have remarked on the cryptic nature of some entries, hinting at phenomena or findings that were never fully explained in official reports. Even simple topographical measurements occasionally contained annotations suggesting anomalies that were never clarified. Government observers shadowed the survey at every step, controlling what could be reported and ensuring sensitive discoveries were kept from public view. Officials monitored the movement of the survey parties, reviewed their notes, and occasionally accompanied them to remote locations under the pretext of logistical support. Letters between team members later revealed a growing awareness that certain observations, particularly those related to unusual rock formations or geological anomalies, were not to be shared outside approved channels. The presence of authorities lent a quiet weight to the expedition, as if every ridge and ravine carried more than natural significance, while the surveyors quietly debated which notes could survive bureaucratic scrutiny. Detailed maps and geological sketches accumulated steadily, only to vanish or be classified, leaving a fragmented record of the expedition's work. Photographs of glaciers, volcanic vents, and stratified rock formations were reportedly sent to central offices, yet only a handful were ever published or referenced in scientific journals. The originals appear to have been reclassified, inaccessible even to later government researchers. Cartographic notes suggest careful measurement, yet entire quadrants of the mountain remained undocumented in official releases, reinforcing the sense that the expedition's output was deliberately suppressed. Even minor details, such as elevations of ridges or lengths of glaciers, were often left blank or vaguely marked. A geologist carefully noted peculiar rock formations, yet his private reflections were excluded from formal reports, raising questions about institutional oversight. Observations of unusual mineral deposits and erosional patterns were detailed in personal notebooks, some of which resurfaced decades later in scattered archives. These fragments hint at the expedition noticing features of Mount Ararat that might have been deemed politically sensitive or scientifically provocative. One entry references a ridge out of alignment with natural strata, a cryptic phrase that has fueled decades of debate. The tension between what was observed in the field and what was ultimately recorded publicly continues to intrigue modern scholars. Fragments of journals and partial survey data, appeared decades later in obscure repositories, revealing tantalizing glimpses of findings never widely shared. Certain photographs, sketches, and measurement tables offer hints of glacier retreat and ridge anomalies that have no counterpart in formal publications. Scholars have debated whether these fragments represent only a fraction of the expedition's work, or if the remainder was purposefully withheld. Regardless, the recovered pieces evoke a sense of what could have been a comprehensive and groundbreaking survey, now forever incomplete. Attempts to cross-reference them with official topographic maps reveal contradictions that deepen the mystery. Annotations on maps suggest certain regions were deliberately left undocumented, hinting at discoveries officials may have preferred to conceal. Handwritten notes in the margins point to features labelled vaguely as restricted or unconfirmed, a rarity in scientific cartography. Some sections appear to have been deliberately erased or omitted when copies were distributed, leaving historians to wonder whether these omissions were precautionary, political, or indicative of something the surveyors themselves could not fully explain. Even modern geologists exploring the same ridges note gaps in recorded data, as though sections of the mountain's geological history were intentionally obscured. Hints of political sensitivities and scientific caution surround the survey, suggesting the suppressed information may have touched on matters deemed too controversial. Mount Ararat sits near sensitive borders, and the mid-20th century context of geopolitical tension could explain why some findings were never released. Early field reports that were declassified in part contain vague references to anomalous formations or traces of glacial shifts, but key supporting data remains missing. Historians debate whether the classification was motivated by strategic considerations, scientific uncertainty, or other reasons that may never be revealed. Even contemporary researchers retracing the survey's path find only scattered evidence, with the majority of the expedition's records still inaccessible or classified. Field notes, fragmentary maps, and a few photographs provide only a shadow of the expedition's full scope, yet they raise as many questions as they answer. The expedition's official reports, when compared with recovered fragments, leave a trail of omissions that hint at extraordinary discoveries, whether geological, environmental, or perhaps entirely unexpected. The mountain's high ridges and snowfields remain as enigmatic today as they were to those early surveyors, their silence amplifying the gaps in the record. Locked away in vaults and forgotten files, the full survey of Mount Ararat waits to be uncovered, hinting at discoveries that may forever alter our understanding of the mountain. The Canadian Arctic Relocation Reconnaissance. Frozen expanses of the Canadian Arctic bore silent witness to a survey whose official traces have almost entirely disappeared. The reconnaissance was part of a broader government initiative to understand the far north, assess resources, and gather information in preparation for planned relocations of northern communities. While some reports were submitted, the bulk of the data was later withdrawn, redacted, or never publicly released. Vast stretches of tundra, frozen rivers, and scattered settlements were observed and recorded. Yet, what survived in public archives represents only a fraction of the original expedition. Scholars examining the period note that the omissions are striking, suggesting more than mere administrative oversight. Mandates from federal offices directed the reconnaissance to record population distributions, hunting grounds, and environmental features, yet few of these instructions survived in public files. Agencies, including the Department of Northern Affairs, coordinated the survey, emphasizing both geographical mapping and social observation. Teams were instructed to collect detailed notes on settlements and seasonal migration patterns, as well as to document terrain for potential infrastructure planning. The political context of the mid-20th century adds a layer of complexity. Relocations were controversial, and any findings could have significant consequences for policy, public perception, and indigenous communities. Teams catalogued settlements, hunting grounds, and waterways with meticulous care, but anomalies in their documentation hint at observations that were intentionally omitted. Surveyors took photographs, created maps, and maintained notebooks, yet these records were inconsistent in both coverage and detail. In some cases, entire villages or hunting areas appear in partial form, with certain pages missing or annotated vaguely. Observers occasionally noted features that were later excluded from official publications, raising questions about what was deemed sensitive or inconvenient. Even minor details, like the routes of frozen rivers or temporary encampments, were sometimes omitted, creating gaps in the historical record. Redactions and classified labels in internal communications indicate multiple layers of oversight, leaving the reasons behind withheld information open to speculation. Interdepartmental memos show that files were reviewed repeatedly, with passages marked restricted or for internal use only. These edits suggest concerns about privacy, political repercussions, or social sensitivities. The level of scrutiny implies that the authorities were aware of the potential implications of the survey, whether related to population management, resource exploitation, or even international scrutiny, yet no explicit reasoning survives in accessible archives. Encounters with local communities were noted in private logs, but subsequent reports often minimized or erased these details, creating gaps in the official narrative. Survey teams observed daily life, hunting practices and traditional structures, but many of these observations were stripped from formal records. In personal letters and notebooks, surveyors expressed frustration at the censorship, hinting at information that might have provided insight into both the environment and the social dynamics of the North. These omissions leave modern researchers reliant on fragments and on the sometimes contradictory recollections of participants to reconstruct events. Several files vanished from archives or were later withdrawn, suggesting deliberate suppression of data rather than simple misplacement. Reports detailing seasonal migration routes, natural resource locations, and settlement patterns were sometimes missing, leaving holes in the historical record. Archival investigations have revealed misfiled logs, partial copies, and intentionally erased notes. The resulting patchwork makes it difficult to discern what the reconnaissance truly observed, prompting speculation about political motives, sensitivity to indigenous rights, or perhaps unintended discoveries considered too controversial to disclose. Occasionally, partial reports and field notes reappeared in lesser-known repositories, providing glimpses of the survey but never a complete picture. These fragments include handwritten annotations, rough maps, and incomplete tables offering tantalizing hints of what the original teams recorded. Some documents reveal careful attention to environmental conditions, seasonal patterns, and infrastructure potential, while others hint at anomalies, vague entries that raise more questions than they answer. Researchers piecing together these remnants confront the challenge of interpreting incomplete data without projecting assumptions onto missing sections. The selective preservation of records points to political and social pressures influencing what was recorded and what was hidden, leaving lingering uncertainty. Certain maps were sanitized, references to specific communities removed, and detailed measurements withheld, implying a deliberate shaping of the narrative. Scholars have debated whether these omissions were intended to protect sensitive populations, avoid controversy over relocation policies, or conceal findings that contradicted official assumptions. The absence of a complete record makes the Canadian Arctic reconnaissance one of the most opaque surveys of the mid-20th century, its true content elusive despite decades of archival study. Scholars attempting to reconstruct the reconnaissance confront fragmented maps, inconsistent reports, and mysterious omissions that resist full explanation. Even with access to declassified portions of the files, patterns remain incomplete and contradictory. Attempts to overlay surviving data with modern mapping reveal both alignment and inconsistency, suggesting that portions of the survey may have been selectively withheld or edited. These gaps complicate both historical and environmental analysis, leaving researchers uncertain about the scope, accuracy, and implications of the original expedition. Despite the scattered evidence, the true scale of the survey, the observations it produced, and the reasons for its classification remain unknown. Modern historians and archivists continue to uncover small fragments of the expedition's legacy, yet no definitive account has emerged. The survey's disappearance from public record raises questions not only about its findings, but also about the broader historical relationship between policy, exploration, and the Arctic's remote communities. Each recovered fragment deepens both understanding and mystery, highlighting the tension between knowledge gained and knowledge concealed. Long-sealed files and obscure documents may conceal a fuller story of the Canadian Arctic reconnaissance, one that challenges every assumption about its scope and purpose. The Lake Vostok reconnaissance silence. Encased in Antarctic ice, Lake Vostok has long evaded full scientific scrutiny, its early reconnaissance wrapped in layers of secrecy. For decades, the lake remained a subject of intrigue for glaciologists and hydrologists alike, buried beneath roughly 4 kilometers of ice. Early Soviet expeditions gathered partial data that hinted at extraordinary conditions, but the majority of their reports were withheld, leaving only fragments available to the international scientific community. The very existence of such a massive subglacial body of water, sealed off from atmospheric contact for millions of years, was enough to make even routine reconnaissance a matter of intense curiosity and cautious secrecy. Extreme pressure and temperatures near -3 degrees Celsius define the hidden waters, challenging any attempt at direct exploration. The ice above Lake Vostok is far from uniform, comprising layers compressed over millennia, each with subtle variations in density and chemical composition. Seasonal shifts in the ice sheet's upper layers impact the stability of surface drilling operations, while crevasses and hidden ridges make landing and transporting equipment a logistical feat. These environmental factors alone were enough to slow early reconnaissance efforts, and they continue to define the limits of modern exploration, reminding researchers how inaccessible and isolated the lake truly is. Soviet drilling teams in the 1970s and 1980s sought to measure depth and water composition, yet much of their data never entered public records. The initial boreholes were painstakingly monitored for temperature, pressure, and ice stratigraphy, providing rare glimpses into the subglacial environment. Some notes and partial logs survived, detailing water column estimates and basal ice interactions, but extensive portions of the survey remain undocumented. The secrecy surrounding the expeditions was heightened by both technological limitations and political caution, as early findings were considered sensitive in the context of Cold War-era scientific competition. Advanced ice-penetrating equipment and sterilization protocols were essential to avoid contamination, and operational constraints often limited what could be recorded. Engineers and scientists devised methods to prevent microbes from modern environments from reaching the ancient subglacial waters, including heated drilling fluids and specialized casing. Even with such precautions, researchers recognized that every measurement risked altering the delicate equilibrium of the lake. Operational limitations, from power constraints to remote station logistics, compounded the difficulty, meaning that only select samples could be gathered, and many observations were recorded in preliminary notes that never reached formal publication. Fragments of chemical analyses, sediment cores, and sonar scans hint at unusual microbial activity and subglacial formations, though official archives remain incomplete. Isolated measurements suggested unexpected salinity gradients, layers of unusual sediment, and potential thermal anomalies at the lake bed. These early observations were never fully contextualized in peer-reviewed publications, leaving scientists to speculate about the implications. Even today, partial datasets provide a tantalizing glimpse into a hidden ecosystem. Yet without the complete reconnaissance records, researchers are left piecing together possibilities from scattered evidence rather than definitive conclusions. Many findings were classified or delayed for decades, leaving gaps that fueled speculation about the lake's environment and potential discoveries. Some of the early drilling logs, once briefly catalogued in Soviet internal reports, were later restricted, inaccessible to international collaborators. The reasons behind such secrecy remain unclear, whether intended to protect scientific prestige, safeguard potentially sensitive ecological information, or simply reflect bureaucratic caution is a matter of ongoing debate. Regardless, the effect was the same: a prolonged silence in which the true nature of Lake Vostok's early reconnaissance remained obscured. Occasional publications and conference presentations offered glimpses of early reconnaissance, but critical data sets remained obscured from broader scientific review. Researchers pieced together fragments of sonar readings, thermal measurements, and basal ice samples, yet the larger picture remained incomplete. Each fragment suggested an environment unlike any on Earth, from potential microbial life isolated for millions of years to geomorphological features that challenged existing models of Antarctic subglacial lakes. These partial releases only deepen the intrigue, giving the international scientific community enough to speculate, but not enough to draw comprehensive conclusions. Gaps in the record have encouraged conjecture about microbial ecosystems, unknown geologic structures, and the lake's influence on Antarctic hydrology. Some hypothesized the existence of unique microbial strains, potentially thriving without sunlight or oxygen for millennia. Others focused on the lake's geological characteristics, suggesting that subglacial ridges and depressions could indicate unknown tectonic activity or past glacial movement. Every missing dataset amplified these questions, as scientists considered what evidence might have been gathered but never shared, and what implications those withheld findings could have for understanding life in extreme environments. Researchers comparing early notes, satellite data, and drilling records struggle to reconcile discrepancies and missing information, revealing the limits of available evidence. Modern technological tools, from radar imaging to remote sensing, provide a broader view of the lake's ice cover and underlying water body, yet they cannot substitute for the original reconnaissance logs. Attempts to reconstruct early surveys are hampered by incomplete data, ambiguous notations, and files that remain classified or lost. The result is a partial mosaic, offering tantalizing insights into Lake Vostok but leaving the true scope of early exploration elusive and unresolved. Even with improved technology and renewed interest, the lake retains an enigmatic quality, and early reconnaissance appears incomplete, frustrating attempts to fully understand its depths. Each new study confirms both the extreme isolation of the environment and the gaps left by previous expeditions. Scientists continue to navigate this tension between what has been measured and what remains inaccessible, balancing technical achievements with the stark reminder that the lake has never been fully revealed to human inquiry. The silence of Lake Vostok persists as both a challenge and a lure, promising discovery while withholding its secrets. Secrets from Lake Vostok's first penetrations may still lie hidden in archives and ice, defying all efforts to reveal the full story. The Antarctic Dry Valleys Incident. An unusual series of observations during early Dry Valleys expeditions vanished from formal reports, leaving a quiet but persistent mystery. Survey teams entered a landscape so stark and arid that even veteran geologists found it otherworldly. Their notebooks recorded fleeting anomalies, brief flickers of light across salt pans, ice formations that grew and vanished within hours, and meteorological shifts that defied predictions. When the official geological papers were published, these passages were absent, leaving gaps that later scientists would struggle to interpret. The incident's erasure was subtle yet deliberate, suggesting that the valley concealed phenomena too unusual to fit standard scientific accounts. Jagged ridges and salt-crusted flats dominate the region, where wind-carved spires and broad, barren plains create an environment unlike any other on the continent. Seasonal shifts bring sudden bursts of sunlight that illuminate the reflective surfaces, making shadows stretch unnaturally across frozen sediments. Microclimates within the valleys allow pockets of frost and ice to persist in places sheltered from the wind, producing patterns that can change overnight. Even the faintest breeze moves fine dust and mineral particles, subtly altering terrain features. These conditions challenged every expedition, as mapping and observation had to contend with an environment that was constantly reshaping itself. Research teams meticulously recorded soil composition, ice remnants, and localized weather conditions, yet some of their most intriguing notes never reached publication. Instruments measured temperature fluctuations, humidity, wind speeds, and electrical properties of the soil, generating data that was carefully logged. Yet references to unusual frost polygons, ephemeral ice ridges, or optical phenomena were conspicuously absent from the final reports. Several explorers remarked on the transitory nature of these features, formations that appeared only under precise atmospheric conditions and disappeared without a trace. The omission of such details has left later researchers with tantalizing glimpses of what might have occurred, yet no complete record. Investigators noted transient light phenomena, sudden gusts that sculpted snow and salt surfaces, and subtle variations in the magnetic field that challenged expectations. Some observers attempted to measure these irregularities with compasses and rudimentary magnetometers, recording fleeting deviations and directional shifts. Sketches in field notebooks portray patterns in the ice that seem to emerge and vanish unpredictably. Although these anomalies were consistent across multiple expeditions, their ephemeral nature made verification difficult. Later, Scientists examining the materials recognized that while the observations could not be fully explained, their repeated occurrence suggested an underlying phenomenon worthy of attention. Official papers omitted these anomalies entirely, producing conspicuous gaps that puzzled later reviewers. Entire passages describing irregular formations, sudden fog banks, or unexplained frost arrangements were excised. When the anomalies were mentioned at all, the language was vague, cautious, and minimized their significance. Archival comparisons reveal that pages containing unusual observations were often left out of compiled reports. These omissions suggest deliberate editorial decisions, leaving a mystery not in what was found, but in what was intentionally left undocumented. Some scholars suggest the omissions reflected doubts about measurement reliability, concern over professional credibility, or encounters with phenomena that lacked a clear explanation. The harsh and unpredictable environment of the dry valleys amplified uncertainty, with instruments frequently malfunctioning or providing inconsistent readings. Explorers may have feared that reporting anomalies would undermine the legitimacy of their work, provoke skepticism, or draw unwanted attention from scientific authorities. Another possibility is that the phenomena themselves were so unprecedented that researchers were reluctant to speculate publicly, leaving the anomalies relegated to private notebooks and marginal sketches. Surviving notebooks and sketches reveal hints of unusual geological and atmospheric behaviour, but they provide no definitive answers. Notes describe ice wedges forming in unusual patterns, sudden frost shifts, and areas where compasses wavered inexplicably. Marginal sketches depict transient shapes and textures on valley floors, some resembling wind-carved sculptures, others appearing almost artificial in symmetry. Even with these artifacts, researchers are left with fragmented evidence, fleeting observations that resist full interpretation. The combination of missing official records and ephemeral environmental phenomena creates a sense of a puzzle only partially visible. Subsequent scientists have debated whether the anomalies reflected natural quirks, previously unobserved environmental processes, or something entirely unexpected. Some hypothesized rare wind patterns or rapid sublimation events could account for unusual frost polygons. Others speculated that unexplored magnetic or geothermal effects influenced ice behavior and soil alignment. Yet none of these explanations completely account for the consistency of the anomalies recorded in early notes, leaving a persistent tension between accepted scientific understanding and the reports of first-hand observers. Teams retracing the original survey routes occasionally detect subtle oddities, though they rarely replicate the extraordinary events noted in early logs. Minor shifts in snow and salt, faint residual frost shapes, and transient electrical anomalies sometimes appear. Yet these encounters are fleeting, ephemeral, and less pronounced than the phenomena documented decades earlier. Each revisit reinforces both the uniqueness of the Dry Valley's environment and the sense that part of the original reconnaissance, its most inexplicable elements, remains inaccessible to observation. The Dry Valleys continue to hold the tension between documented observations and unexplained occurrences, leaving the full story of the incident unresolved. Modern studies employ high-resolution satellite imaging, automated sensors, and geophysical scans, but the anomalies recorded by early field teams often elude verification. The combination of extreme environmental conditions, missing documentation, and the ephemeral nature of the phenomena creates a lasting enigma. Observers today can glimpse patterns, measure shifts, and analyze surfaces, yet the most curious events from the original expeditions remain elusive. Buried within overlooked notebooks and redacted observations lies the possibility of discoveries in the Dry Valleys that challenge conventional understanding and may never be fully revealed. The unpublished Sahara mapping mission. A field expedition traversed uncharted reaches of the Sahara, yet most of its detailed mapping never reached formal publication, leaving the mission cloaked in uncertainty. Surveyors faced a desert so vast and unrelenting that even seasoned geographers were struck by its scale and harshness. Their mission was simple in theory: record accurate topography, trace previously unknown features, and produce maps that would expand understanding of one of the world's most forbidding landscapes. In practice, however, the expedition encountered relentless heat, shifting sands and terrain that seemed to resist measurement, forcing them to improvise with each passing day. Yet the official record is scant and crucial sections of their work remain absent, leaving the full scope of the mission an enigma. Towering dunes and scattered stone outcrops create a labyrinthine landscape where heat waves distort both distance and perception at every step. Travellers describe the horizon as a mirage of jagged peaks and distant dunes that appear to move with the shifting sun. Blinding sunlight reflects from the pale sands, making precise navigation nearly impossible without careful calibration of instruments. Isolated rock formations cast long shadows that shift hour by hour, adding to the illusion of movement in the desert. The sheer emptiness, punctuated only by occasional vegetation or rocky ridges, imposes a sense of disorientation, where familiar methods of surveying are constantly challenged. Surveyors relied on theodolites, sextants, and early aerial photography to record precise coordinates across terrain that defied conventional mapping methods. Instruments had to be protected from sand, dust, and high temperatures that threatened to warp sensitive components. Daily measurements were taken under harsh conditions, with teams noting longitude, latitude, and elevation, and comparing readings for consistency. Compasses occasionally wavered in areas of unusual magnetic influence, and sunlight reflections complicated optical instruments. Despite these obstacles, meticulous logs were maintained, demonstrating the expedition's commitment to precision even when environmental factors seemed intent on undermining it. Explorers noted unusual geological formations, concealed depressions, and windswept patterns in the sand that challenged existing cartographic knowledge. Small valleys appeared where none were expected, while dunes sometimes formed angular shapes rather than the smooth curves typical of desert landscapes. Erosion patterns suggested subterranean water channels long since vanished, leaving traces of unusual sediment deposits. Certain rock outcrops displayed anomalous mineral patterns, hinting at geological processes not yet fully understood. These observations were carefully sketched in field notebooks, yet most never appeared in official reports, creating a sense of lost knowledge even within the team. Blistering heat, sandstorms, and equipment failure often erased observations before they could be transcribed into permanent records. Pages were smudged by windblown grit, ink faded under relentless sunlight, and instruments occasionally malfunctioned mid-measurement. Entire sketches were lost when notebooks were damaged or misplaced during sudden desert storms. The combination of environmental hazards and delicate equipment meant that even careful recording was only partially successful. This ephemeral nature of the field data contributed to gaps in the official documentation and left tantalizing clues of what might have been captured. Official archives include only selective findings, with entire segments of data missing, fueling speculation over intentional suppression or accidental destruction. Reports were edited before submission, yet some scientists later noted that certain anomalies and topographic irregularities had been entirely omitted. Whether these omissions reflected uncertainty, political considerations, or desire to avoid drawing attention to sensitive findings is unknown. The surviving documents provide a narrow view of the expedition's work, emphasizing routine topography and omitting any references to surprising discoveries or unusual desert formations. Hand-drawn sketches, partial aerial photos, and annotated logs reveal tantalizing details, though the full scope of the expedition's work remains elusive. Some diagrams show depressions in unexpected locations, while marginal notes hint at unusual sediment coloration or sand patterns. Photographs captured fleeting shapes in the dunes, visible only under precise lighting conditions. Each fragment suggests that the expedition recorded more than the maps and reports suggest, yet the incomplete nature of these artifacts leaves the narrative unfinished, allowing the desert itself to guard its secrets. Scholars later debated whether some omissions reflected politically sensitive discoveries, unverified anomalies, or features too enigmatic to report. Certain findings might have contradicted accepted cartographic conventions, or hinted at resources whose disclosure was deemed strategically inappropriate. Others argued that environmental anomalies, perhaps due to rare weather or geological phenomena, simply could not be verified and were therefore excluded. The lack of clarification perpetuated uncertainty, creating a tension between what was observed on the ground and what reached public knowledge. Modern satellite imagery and digital terrain models occasionally corroborate early observations, yet they cannot fully replicate the first-hand impressions of the surveyors. Aerial surveys show depressions, dune alignments, and isolated rock formations consistent with some early sketches. Still, the nuanced details, shadows at certain times, ephemeral sand patterns, and microtopographic anomalies cannot be captured from orbit. Attempts to retrace the expedition's routes on the ground confirm that the desert continues to shift and change, making precise replication impossible and preserving the sense of mystery surrounding the original findings. The Sahara mission continues to challenge historians, leaving its true findings incomplete, fragmented, and tantalizingly out of reach. Each re-evaluation of archives combined with modern tools illuminates certain aspects of the expedition while leaving others obscured. The missing maps, partial logs, and unexplained notes collectively create an enduring puzzle, one that invites speculation yet resists definitive answers. Scholars and cartographers alike remain intrigued by the gaps, wondering whether they reflect lost knowledge, deliberate suppression, or simply the desert's own impermanence. Clues embedded in overlooked notes and partial maps suggest that the Sahara may still conceal discoveries that have never been acknowledged or fully recorded. The expedition that reached the wrong pole. Icy plains extended beyond sight, a featureless expanse where subtle variations in the terrain could trick even experienced explorers. The horizon seemed unbroken, yet careful observation revealed small rises and depressions that could mislead the eye and the instruments alike. Wind-sculpted ridges shifted slowly with time, and snowdrifts moved in patterns that altered familiar paths within hours. Every step required caution, as even a minor misjudgment could compound over distance, placing the expedition further from its intended coordinates. The relentless cold penetrated layers of clothing, and the biting wind carried fine ice particles that made vision and measurement difficult. Despite these challenges, the team pressed onward, documenting observations in journals that would later reveal contradictions with the official narrative. Fierce winds and sudden whiteouts obscured landmarks, turning navigation into a near-impossible challenge. Features that appeared solid and permanent during clear conditions vanished beneath rolling snow and swirling blizzards. Explorers relied on fleeting glimpses of ridges, crevasses, and distant ice formations to estimate their position. But the landscape was mercilessly deceptive. Tracks left behind could disappear in minutes, forcing constant recalibration of bearings. Moments of clarity were rare, yet they became vital for confirming any progress, as a single miscalculation could set the entire route off course by miles. Every decision carried weight, amplified by the extreme isolation and the knowledge that no immediate rescue was possible. Navigational instruments faltered under sub-zero temperatures, with compasses swinging unpredictably in areas affected by polar magnetic anomalies. Sextants, while precise, demanded ideal light conditions, and frost accumulation on lenses often rendered readings unreliable. Chronometers, essential for calculating longitude, lost accuracy as the cold impaired their mechanisms. Even minor errors were magnified over the vast distances of the polar plateau, introducing growing uncertainty into each day's position estimates. Despite meticulous procedures, the instruments themselves seemed to conspire with the harsh environment, producing contradictory readings that forced explorers to rely on both skill and intuition. Team members recorded inconsistencies between star positions and estimated locations, creating unease about their exact route. Journals describe nights when the stars appeared subtly displaced, yielding calculations that conflicted with prior observations and visible terrain. Such discrepancies led to repeated cross-checks and adjustments as navigators attempted to reconcile celestial data with the deceptive surface below. These moments of doubt persisted throughout the expedition, highlighting the precarious balance between recorded precision and human judgment under extreme conditions. In some entries, subtle language hints at frustration, the mental strain of isolation, and the tension between completing the mission and acknowledging uncertainty. Observers noted optical illusions that transformed the ice into a landscape of uncertainty. Distant ridges shifted with the light, frozen waves in the snow appeared like barriers, and faint mirages created phantom horizons. Light refracted unpredictably across the ice, casting shadows that suggested valleys or obstacles where none existed. Such distortions were disorienting, particularly when visibility was limited and landmarks appeared to move as if alive. Even experienced surveyors admitted that perception alone could not be trusted. Each sighting demanded verification through instruments, careful observation, and sometimes repeated measurements. These illusions amplified the risk of misnavigation, rendering even small deviations potentially significant over the vast distances travelled. Later maps presented a smooth, uninterrupted path to the pole, omitting the confusion and errors encountered in the field. Official accounts portrayed a precise, unbroken route, leaving no hint of the miscalculations, rerouted paths, or uncertainty that permeated the expedition. Contradictory field notes and partial sketches existed, but they were largely ignored in the official narrative. The sanitized maps suggested a mastery over conditions that the explorers themselves knew was far from reality. This gap between documented experience and formal reporting has persisted, inviting speculation about deliberate correction or concealment of navigational mistakes. Private journals, preserved in fragments, reveal moments of hesitation, improvised adjustments, and critical decisions made under environmental duress. Handwritten notes describe altered courses to avoid windswept crevasses, extended detours due to snowdrifts, and decisions taken at the edge of exhaustion. Sketches depict misaligned landmarks, provisional markers, and alternative paths considered but ultimately unrecorded in official maps. Together, these fragments offer a glimpse of the expedition's reality, a journey dictated by both ambition and the relentless unpredictability of the polar landscape, with human judgment repeatedly tested against the forces of nature. Exhaustion, frostbite, and the psychological toll of prolonged isolation intensified every misstep, making navigation as much a challenge of mind as of skill. Days merged under constant cold, and the monotony of featureless ice weighed heavily on concentration. Mental fatigue led to errors in calculation, misinterpretation of landmarks, and over-reliance on instruments that themselves were prone to failure. Leadership decisions under these conditions shaped not only the physical path of the expedition, but also the record that would survive, determining which observations were preserved and which were omitted. Human frailty combined with environmental deception creates gaps in understanding that even modern analyses struggle to fill. Modern analyses using satellite imagery, GPS data, and digital models highlight discrepancies between original field notes and official coordinates. Certain claimed locations were likely off by miles, while some terrain features noted in journals were absent or shifted on published maps. These findings lend credence to the theory that the expedition reached a point close to, but not exactly at, the intended pole. Attempts to retrace the journey reveal the persistent difficulty of reconciling historical observations with contemporary geospatial tools, leaving portions of the expedition route uncertain and still debated among polar researchers. Despite careful reconstruction, the expedition's exact trajectory remains a puzzle, with critical segments lost to time, environmental changes, and post-expedition alterations. Maps, reports, and surviving logs provide fragments of information, but the true path, the missteps, recalculations, and environmental challenges cannot be fully retraced. Each analysis raises further questions about the nature of exploration under extreme conditions, the limits of human perception, and the influence of environmental factors on recorded history. The expedition endures as both a technical achievement and an enduring mystery, challenging assumptions about precision, accuracy, and the official record. Among the ice, wind, and polished maps, the true course of the journey remains concealed, a path that may never be reconstructed in full. The US Navy's Operation High Jump revisions. Operation High Jump began as one of the largest Antarctic expeditions ever launched, yet its abrupt termination left a trail of unanswered questions in both official and personal accounts. Tasked with establishing bases, conducting aerial surveys, and gathering intelligence on the icy continent, the operation represented a convergence of military planning, scientific ambition, and logistical daring. Crews faced vast ice fields, shifting snow and winds that could reach hurricane strength, forcing constant adaptation to conditions that were as unforgiving as they were unpredictable. Despite meticulous documentation, gaps and inconsistencies in reports would later suggest a reality more complex than the public record implied. Even in the earliest days of the expedition, observers noted subtle signs that not everything would proceed as planned. Supply lines were tested by shifting ice and sudden storms, and communication with command was often delayed or interrupted, leaving crews to make critical decisions on their own. Some navigators recorded irregularities in magnetic readings that complicated mapping efforts, while pilots found visual landmarks obscured or distorted by snow and fog. These early challenges foreshadowed the inconsistencies and omissions that would later appear in official reports, suggesting that from the very outset, Operation High Jump operated under conditions both extreme and in some ways unknowable. The fleet moved with extraordinary precision, yet the environment itself often dictated terms. Icebreakers forged channels through frozen waters, aircraft were launched from decks slick with frost, and personnel navigated both the sea and sky under relentless polar weather. Specialized reconnaissance planes, fitted with cameras and sensors, attempted to chart coastlines, glaciers, and mountain ranges previously unseen by outsiders. Flight schedules were repeatedly altered due to shifting ice and sudden storms, and even the smallest delays risked cascading effects across the expedition. Each maneuver was recorded, yet subsequent reports would obscure the challenges faced, leaving only a streamlined version of events. Mission objectives were ambitious: survey unexplored regions, establish temporary bases, test equipment in extreme conditions, and collect scientific data on geology, meteorology, and ice dynamics. Aircraft crews logged countless hours in sub-zero temperatures, while ship crews managed navigation, supplies, and emergency contingencies. Every observation required calibration against both instruments and human judgment, as polar anomalies often rendered compasses unreliable and visual cues deceptive. Despite the apparent thoroughness of these operations, the official narrative omitted certain flights, detours, and unplanned landings, raising questions about what had occurred during these undocumented moments. Antarctica's weather proved both unpredictable and unforgiving, forcing frequent operational pauses and impromptu adjustments. Gale-force winds, sudden blizzards, and dense fog could immobilize ships for days, while frostbite and exhaustion afflicted crew members during long hours in the open air. Even short reconnaissance flights demanded exacting preparation, as landing on an icy plateau carried life-or-death stakes. Logs show moments when missions were altered mid-flight, yet these deviations were seldom referenced in the published reports. The tension between survival, exploration, and documentation was constant, shaping both decisions in the field and the records that would later endure. Abrupt changes in orders and curtailed missions appear repeatedly in operational logs, hinting at incidents left out of the official narrative. Some flights were rerouted to avoid unstable ice, while others were aborted after visual anomalies in the terrain created navigational uncertainty. Pilots recorded unusual formations and unanticipated obstacles, yet these entries were often removed or redacted from public documentation. The contrast between real-time experience and sanitized reporting is stark, suggesting either operational discretion or the concealment of findings deemed sensitive in the context of post-war military strategy. Subsequent official reports were heavily edited, with entire sections restricted, redacted, or classified, creating a narrative that diverged from first-hand accounts. Maps were simplified, photographs withheld, and written summaries condensed, producing an appearance of uninterrupted success despite the documented challenges. Scholars and analysts have long speculated about the reasons for these omissions, considering political, strategic, and environmental factors. While much of the classified material remains inaccessible, hints in surviving documents suggest that certain observations, whether unusual topography, ice formations, or logistical anomalies, were considered too sensitive to include in public records. Personal accounts, partially declassified or leaked decades later, provide glimpses of discrepancies between what was observed and what was reported. Crew members described ice ridges that moved with shifting wind patterns, aircraft navigating without clear visual references, and makeshift decisions made under extreme duress. Some logs note unexpected land formations and glacier features that were never acknowledged in the official narrative, while anecdotal evidence hints at unusual weather phenomena that temporarily grounded entire squadrons. These fragments create a patchwork of information that implies a more complicated reality than the sanitized official reports convey. Analysts examining these records suggest that operational hazards, environmental conditions, and possibly undisclosed findings prompted the revisions and omissions. Some posit that sensitive scientific discoveries or strategic reconnaissance could have influenced the decision to classify or redact certain segments. Others argue that the sheer scale and unpredictability of the operation made complete documentation impractical, and that errors and inconsistencies were streamlined for clarity. Regardless, the tension between what occurred and what was officially recorded fuels continuing debate among historians, geographers, and polar researchers. Modern reconstructions using satellite imagery and geospatial analysis partially confirm the routes flown and areas surveyed by Operation High Jump, yet discrepancies remain. Certain features documented in field logs appear altered or absent in official maps, and areas believed to have been visited correspond imperfectly with later satellite observations. These inconsistencies suggest navigational challenges, environmental changes, or selective editing, and they leave scholars without a complete understanding of the expedition's scope. Even with advanced technology, portions of the fleet's activity remain enigmatic, resisting full verification. The true sequence of events, including the reasons behind the abrupt termination and subsequent revisions, continues to elude researchers. Every analysis uncovers further questions about operational decision-making, environmental hazards, and the influence of secrecy on historical record-keeping. Despite decades of investigation, no definitive account reconciles first-hand observations with official documentation, leaving gaps in understanding and preserving an enduring mystery about the operation's full extent. The reality of what occurred during Operation High Jump is obscured, leaving only traces of action, decision, and unexplained deviation to hint at a story still largely untold. The Dead Sea Scrolls survey that vanished. The field expedition into the caves near the Dead Sea was expected to illuminate centuries of human history, yet key journals and survey notes simply vanished before the findings could be fully examined. Teams arrived with precise instructions and careful instruments, prepared to document every niche and artifact with the methodical rigour demanded by archaeology. What began as a routine survey quickly revealed the delicate fragility of both the scroll fragments and the caves themselves, requiring painstaking attention to avoid damage. Yet as work progressed, the disparity between recorded observations and what eventually surfaced in archives began to suggest that a significant portion of the expedition's results had quietly disappeared. Limestone cliffs stretched along the shoreline, their fissures and overhangs concealing hidden chambers where light barely penetrated and dust threatened to swallow any trace of activity. The caves, carved over millennia by natural erosion, presented uneven floors, low ceilings, and narrow passages that forced archaeologists to crawl and crouch as they carefully examined every surface. Airborne dust shimmered in the faint shafts of sunlight, while shadows concealed deeper recesses where even the most experienced researchers hesitated to venture. These environmental challenges intensified the difficulty of maintaining accurate records, particularly when dealing with parchment fragments that could crumble at the slightest touch. Archaeologists and documentarians moved deliberately, measuring, sketching, and photographing every fragment they encountered, aware that the slightest mistake could erase evidence that had survived millennia. Each discovery was catalogued with painstaking precision, tiny glyphs recorded in ink, faint impressions traced on paper, and photographs labelled with coordinates and condition notes. Tools were sterilised, gloves were changed constantly, and even routine movement within the caves was controlled to prevent contamination. The meticulous pace ensured that each find could be reliably referenced later, yet the disappearing records would later obscure the full extent of this careful work. Initial investigations uncovered text fragments and unexplored niches that suggested the potential for discoveries beyond what anyone had anticipated, sparking excitement that quickly became tense caution. Teams reported previously unseen scroll fragments tucked into crevices, unusual mineral deposits on walls, and narrow passages that appeared to lead to additional chambers. Field notes indicated that some of these spaces might contain materials untouched since antiquity, yet descriptions in official reports would later omit nearly all mention of these potentially groundbreaking discoveries. The contrast between personal observations and the public record created an early tension, one that would only grow as documents began to vanish. Within weeks, anomalies arose. Some notebooks were incomplete, photographic negatives went missing, and field annotations contradicted one another, hinting at interruptions or deliberate omissions in the recording process. Certain pages contained erasures or notes removed in ink, while photographs of key fragments could not be located in the archives. Researchers noted discrepancies between the accounts of different team members, with some describing areas absent from official survey maps. These gaps were not minor clerical errors. They suggested that substantial portions of the survey had either been misplaced or deliberately withheld. Administrative oversight and archival review revealed sections of the survey were withheld from public access, leaving modern researchers with incomplete datasets and a sense of deliberate absence in the historical record. Requests for original notes and photographic negatives were met with partial disclosures, often accompanied by references to lost, classified, or restricted materials. Even when fragments were returned, they arrived with labels inconsistent with field logs, creating further confusion about provenance and original context. The partial nature of the surviving archive underscored the difficulty of reconstructing the expedition's work and the scope of what may have been permanently lost. Later, historians analysing the remaining materials noted gaps too consistent to be accidental, raising the possibility that portions of the survey were intentionally suppressed for reasons that remain unexplained. Some speculate that certain finds were deemed politically sensitive, culturally restricted, or simply too controversial for publication. Others argue that bureaucratic disorganisation may have played a role, but the pattern of missing materials, especially in locations of particular archaeological significance, suggests deliberate curation rather than mere negligence. Each gap deepened the sense of mystery surrounding the survey and the Dead Sea's hidden chambers. The missing documentation complicates modern study of the Dead Sea Scrolls, leaving critical questions unanswered about the provenance of fragments and the full extent of the original survey's findings. Researchers attempting to trace the chain of custody for certain texts encounter inconsistencies in dates, locations, and handling procedures. Some fragments appear in multiple archives with conflicting annotations, while others are cited in publications but cannot be verified against surviving records. This uncertainty has influenced interpretations of the scrolls, contributing to ongoing debates about the authenticity, context, and chronological placement of many texts. Some surviving sketches, photographs, and memoirs hint at discoveries lost to the official record, revealing glimpses of inscriptions, hidden chambers, or artifact arrangements that may never be fully understood. Detailed illustrations in personal notebooks show walls lined with fragments too delicate to move, and photographs capture narrow alcoves where further artifacts may have once rested. Memoirs describe the thrill of encountering previously undocumented texts, the meticulous care required to document them, and the growing unease when materials failed to reach public or institutional archives. These fragments form a patchwork that evokes the expedition's accomplishments while underscoring the absence of its full narrative. Even after years of cross-referencing records, field notes, and secondary sources, the expedition's most revealing data continues to elude verification, leaving an enduring gap in the story of one of the region's most significant archaeological undertakings. Every attempt to reconcile surviving fragments with published studies raises new questions, and the survey's missing elements remain a source of fascination and frustration for historians, archaeologists, and textual scholars alike. What was recorded, and what was quietly erased, lingers as an unresolved shadow over the Dead Sea, suggesting secrets that may never be recovered. The Belgica follow-up that never happened. The second Belgica expedition was meticulously drafted on paper, yet the ship never sailed, leaving Antarctic ambition suspended in uncertainty. Every route, supply list, and scientific objective was carefully considered, as if the voyage existed in theory alone. Plans included months of travel across uncharted ice, observation posts to monitor weather and wildlife, and surveys intended to surpass the achievements of the original Belgica expedition. Yet the dream of return was quietly dissolved by bureaucratic hesitation, political caution, and logistical complexity, leaving only the echoes of what might have been and the faint traces of ambition etched in archival documents. The first voyage had revealed both the promise and perils of polar research, inspiring plans that would have expanded understanding of ice, wildlife, and weather patterns. Adrien de Gerlach's crew had endured months of isolation in 1897, 1899, documenting extreme conditions, mapping coastline features, and collecting biological specimens that fascinated European scientists. Their observations established benchmarks for endurance, navigation, and scientific rigour in Antarctic conditions. The proposed follow-up sought to build on this foundation. intending to explore untouched regions and confirm preliminary findings, yet it never advanced beyond paper. Maps and charts were prepared with painstaking detail, projecting routes along uncharted coastlines and the placement of temporary camps for scientific observation. These documents indicated where sled teams might travel, where shore landings were feasible, and which glaciers offered insight into climate and geological history. Coastal surveys were planned for previously inaccessible bays, while aerial observations, though rudimentary for the time, were considered for extended reconnaissance. Every line on the map suggested ambition, careful calculation, and the hope of discoveries that might rival the first expedition's legacy, yet these lines remained frozen on paper, never traced by boots or sleds. Organisers struggled with the scale of provisioning and equipment, calculating months of isolation in extreme cold while accounting for unpredictable sea ice and shifting glaciers. Ships needed reinforced hulls to withstand crushing pressure, supplies had to last beyond anticipated delays, and emergency measures were painstakingly drafted for survival in case of disaster. Specialised instruments were prepared to measure temperature, wind patterns, and ocean currents, while smaller teams would focus on cataloguing flora, fauna, and geological formations. Despite careful planning, the sheer magnitude of these logistical demands contributed to growing concern among decision-makers and a mounting sense of caution that ultimately paralysed progress. Communications between expedition committees and government offices hint at hesitation, as authorities questioned whether the potential discoveries justified the risks involved. Letters and notes revealed deliberations over insurance, funding, and diplomatic permissions, reflecting an awareness of both scientific opportunity and extreme danger. Discussions acknowledged the success of the first Belgica expedition, but also weighed lessons learned from its hardships, including crew health, ship damage, and the unpredictable environment. The balance between ambition and caution appears to have tipped in favour of inaction, leaving the project stalled while the Antarctic remained untouched. Bureaucratic delays and unresolved approvals gradually stalled the mission, leaving logistical plans incomplete and the expedition's fate suspended in quiet ambiguity. Funding applications lingered without resolution, ship modifications were postponed indefinitely, and assigned personnel returned to other duties. The meticulous preparation remained on paper, never transforming into action, and the continent that had been mapped and studied in part by de Galach's crew remained mostly unexplored. Over time, the plans themselves seemed to fade from institutional memory, surviving only as faint annotations and marginalia in archival folders that hinted at extraordinary ambition. Scientific ambitions included collecting ice core samples, observing migratory patterns, and documenting geological formations that might have redefined contemporary understanding of the continent. Teams were to study long-term climate indicators preserved in glacial layers, chart unknown mountain ranges, and record the behaviour of penguin colonies and seal populations in winter months. Each objective promised to expand knowledge, yet none were realised, leaving a tangible void in the scientific record of the early 20th century Antarctic landscape. Even instruments and experimental devices, carefully constructed for the follow-up, remained unused, their potential insights frozen in time alongside the plans themselves, silently waiting for a mission that would never arrive. Analysis of contemporary correspondence shows that multiple factors contributed to the cancellation. Financial constraints proved significant, as outfitting an expedition capable of months-long isolation was prohibitively expensive. International tensions in the years following the original Belgica voyage created hesitation among nations interested in Antarctic research, while the perception of extreme risk, born out of de Gerlach's reports of frostbite, scurvy, and near misses with the ice, deterred final approval. Environmental concerns alone may have been decisive, as planners feared the hazards of unpredictable ice shelves and severe storms, imagining potential tragedies that could tarnish national prestige. Records preserved in archives, though sparse, offer glimpses of the scale of preparation, assignments of crew responsibilities, inventories of instruments and provisions, and contingency plans for emergencies that would never arise. The intention to deploy sled teams for inland surveys, marine parties for biological sampling, and observation stations for weather data reflects a level of ambition both daring and methodical. These documents, though limited, suggest a vision of exploration designed to push the boundaries of human knowledge, only to be silenced by circumstance and inaction. They evoke a sense of what might have been measured, observed, and mapped if the voyage had sailed into the Antarctic horizon. The cancelled expedition created a gap in Antarctic exploration, influencing future missions and leaving unanswered questions about what might have been learned. Later expeditions would benefit from technological advances and new approaches, but the lost opportunity of the Belgica follow-up remained, a lingering what-if in the history of exploration. The absence of this follow-up left blank spaces on early 20th century maps and prevented verification of the initial observations made during de Gerlach's journey. The continent's secrets, partially glimpsed yet never fully investigated, continued to inspire curiosity and conjecture for decades afterward, as if the Antarctic itself had withheld the next chapter of its story. The Belgica's intended return lingers as an uncharted chapter in polar history, its discoveries imagined but never made, echoing across the frozen expanse.